start streaming. I'm pressing tweet on that. And hi, you're with Scott. I'm Ganjikidd, Grave Kipper. It's midnight. It's always midnight. This is your right ear and your left ear. And this is the sound check. And it comes through. I'm pressing. Yeah, I can hear myself. I'm just going to check I can hear Steve, if he'll say something.
Hi, I'm Steve of the Dead. I'm not Scott Ganjikidd, who's actually doing the soundcheck stuff. I just sit here and I talk bollocks, and then at the end of it, I go away and do other stuff. And Scott's sat there with the raw files and thinking 3 hours of Scott Ganjikidd, who's...
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, I can. Sorry, I had you twice in my headphones. I didn't know if it was you talking or you up in the monitor. Okay, we're away. We're away. I'm going to do my bit of introduction, and then we're going to get started. So... this is Thus, a podcast about people and how they think, how they feel and how they behave. Tonight is Halloween and I'm joined appropriately by Steve of the Dead. Steve's a forensic psychologist and our subject tonight is the dramatization of murder and other crimes. If you've never been murdered, let me tell you, it's pretty inconvenient for the victim. Despite it being the most heinous of crimes, the murderer can sometimes be seen as some kind of celebrity, with books, films and TV dramatisations focused on their character. It must really annoy the people they kill. A warning, I'm going to make a few jokes as we move through a sometimes difficult topic, but we're going to discuss the changing media representation of killers, the famous cases, and we're going to examine the continued fascination the audience has with real crime drama. Later in the episode, we'll talk about YouTube and how the murder media is changing, before finally asking the most difficult question of all. Why do people like you want to hear the worst things in the world? Your chat's being displayed on screen and at opportune moments we'll pick out your messages, but for the benefit of all those who have the podcast on in the background, I'm generally going to let the conversation flow and take precedence. So let's get into it. He's drinking his Lucozade. That's the man himself. He's going to drink his Lucozade. Real life drama and crime. Go. So cinema has had a long time. This is Steve of the Dead. I've introduced him already. Cinema has a long time had a long love affair with murder, from the Hitchcock's Lodger in 1927, Jack the Ripper inspired films and then Double Indemnity with Bruce Brown's Schneider's murder. I got all this off Wikipedia, to be honest. To modern titles like Zodiac, they keep the audience enthralled in a dance between criminal and detective. Steve, start off. How do you think crime portrayal has changed through the years? And let's start off with the early days, probably the earliest known big case, Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, I was going to start off with we could go further back than just cinema. We could look at like the earliest days of the printing press. Well, not the earliest days of the printing press, but the moment that printing mass, like distribution of printed media, becomes a serious thing. So when newspapers are able to be printed daily, around the turn of the century, Victorian era time, and books can be pumped out on the cheap. All those things matter because they allow for the distribution of information. And before that, when a murder would happen in a village or a town somewhere, people in towns over wouldn't hear about it because information travelled slowly. But here and now, in the Victorian era, right, we've suddenly got this technology to have reporting on crimes happening be written up and be printed and then be distributed to people within a day, if not hours. You would have evening prints of newspapers. So that is the moment when people suddenly become aware of crime happening in other places, and because they're aware of it, these are depictions of crime that they're like, oh my god, this could happen to me, this could happen in our town, this could be happening right now. The media responds to this increased demand for knowledge and for information and for, I need to know if it's happening in my town, by printing more, and they write more because people are buying it. People are picking up the papers and going, my god, who's been murdered next? And all of a sudden this new type of criminal appears in the incredibly cramped, claustrophobic corridors and streets of London, swamped in fog and gaslight. It's a serial killer. It's what we would now call a serial killer, even though that term wouldn't come for like at least 70 or 80 years.
Can I interject with a question here at this point? Was it more common? Was murder more... I don't know if we know the stats about historical murder, but there were fewer people around, I suppose, wasn't there? The cities were less busy, but it would have been more maybe easy to get away with it. Do you think it was more common?
I don't know. Like you say, it's hard to know the stats from that period because
people would have got away with things. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and they just generally didn't have like the institution of a police force to actually have the facility to measure the crime. You know, think about how we measure crime now. We either have police forces report it, or we have the Crime Survey of England and Wales. I think it's different. used to be called like the Crime Survey of England and Wales. And what they would do was fold up a representative number of people and interview them about the crimes that they've experienced. And they would then extrapolate from that. They would work out from that, try to be as representative as possible. But those two figures, the results that those two sort of recorded methods give you, aren't an actual depiction of the true level of crime. This is what, in forensic psychology, it's called the dark number. And it's like the actual number of crimes committed. And you can never know it, because you can never know every crime that's being committed right now. You know, so back then they didn't have that sort of level of being able to measure it. So what you have like a population density and distribution as well. Consider you also have all these other factors like how safe things were, and how likely things that were accidents were to be considered murders, or how likely things were murders to be accidents. You know, so there's a lot of things like general health of the population, the life expectancy, general health care, you know, something that would change like a beating to a murder, things like that. There's all sorts of reasons that they didn't really have that sort of crime statistic available at the time.
So taking us back then to that time,
police force at that point.
Yeah, so taking us back again to that time when you first hear about these reports, in which is the main media of the time, isn't it? The newspapers. That would become like your first exposure, big news. Do go on, setting the scene and taking us through that time.
Yeah, at that point you also have like an increasing literacy of the population happening. You have people are now being taught to, so there's more of a potential audience for this mass media to be distributed to. So you have more people wanting to know, more people with the ability to know, and the ability to give them information. And most of the time, again, crime reporting sort of came from journalists, you know, because they're talking to the people there at the time. They're talking to, or they're in the pub listening for gossip. And they're the ones that are sort of picking up the bits of information and distributing. It doesn't come from like statements from police about incidents last night. You know, those are rare things to get. You had to actually go to like police commissioners.
The facts are maybe not so available.
Yeah, the facts weren't. So in times when the facts were not readily available to the journalists had to embellish it, and it either became picking up rumours from wherever they could, unverified sources or questionable information, or they would just make shit up wholesale. And there wasn't really like a fact-checking mechanism in place either. There wasn't even a way to like address your grievances with the newspaper by who printed wrong information. Those things are still yet to come. So there's this sort of developing confluence of factors that allows for the story of a criminal being born, basically, a new type of criminal occurring on the scene to be wildly misrepresented. And so it is that one man decides to kill 5 women, and 100 years later we're still talking about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, so hello to everyone in chat. We're going to keep rolling with the conversation, but just a big hello to everyone. It's interesting, isn't it, that this first notable crime is one that we're still revisiting, dramatizing to this day. And it may be down to the case that in that early first reporting of Jack the Ripper, it was so dramatically reported that it caught the public attention and has maintained to this day. Maybe it's a combination of the truth, but also that embellishment by the media that's kept it alive over like we look back and think of this almost super villainous character who was stalking the streets at night, don't we?
Yeah, it's an amazing, once again, it's an amazing confluence of things. You have the media suddenly unaware of how to deal with. Sorry,
Derek with the time machine in chat. I had to.
Oh, well done.
A bit of an in joke there. Yeah, sorry, do carry on.
If that is actually it, that could actually be it. So you have this like media that's now able to sort of report on things, not having the sort of understanding of this new thing to be able to report on, and this absence of certifiable information, because they can't go and check. All they know is bodies are being discovered. On the recording of the first crime, it's a body discovered in Whitechapel. There's nothing. They don't know anything about who could have done it. They only know what happened to the victim. They only know, he was mauled. Basically.
And this is where forensic psychology comes in. Sorry to step over you talking again, but the forensic psychologist, from what I understand, what I understand is that you start with that murder scene, the victim, and you piece together what you assume or decide about the murderer through that investigation of the victim and how the crime is committed. Is that right?
Well, that would well be a profiler, forensic
Okay.
psychologist. But yeah, there is an element of that to it because again, you have this new field of psychology that's just developing.
Of
As well.
course, yeah.
Jack
It
the
didn't
Ripper,
exist back
I
then,
think
yeah.
it's sort of coming into time. You've got Sigmund Freud at least around this period, but I think Wilhelm Wundt was like a couple of years off making the first institute specifically for studying psychology. I think that was 1901. If I remember correctly, that might be 1911. I'm pretty sure it's 1901, and the Ripper murders predate that by a few. So you have this new field that doesn't even sort of exist at this point, but a couple of years later will be used and sort of like start to look at things. And from then on, you have like a whole historical. It's like mentioning Freud in just general psychology classes. You know, going back to Jack the Ripper in forensic psychology classes is one of those things that's like, yeah, right. Got it out of the way. Let's move on to actual proper stuff. So you get it out of the way because it's such a integral part of the field because it's just around the same time. And later on, you could have gone back if you'd gone back 5 or 10 years later. You might have made a difference. Probably not. Again, it's academic at this point. We're talking about 120 years ago, but it is a thing that's sort of brought in because police are desperate. You don't have any sort of forensic evidence. There's no way to like test blood samples. There's sparse victim eyewitness statements. There's very little to go on. And again, this is the sort of development of a police force as well. We still don't have like a nationwide police force at the moment. We still have like regional things. They're called the peelers. They're like the predecessors of the police, the Bobby Peelers. So there's all these things that allow this one thing to happen, this one crime, this one type of crime, this new criminal to be discovered. And the public are just not prepared for it. They don't have the Institute of the Police to protect them from it because the police can't. They're struggling. You don't have like experts that can tell you what's happening and how to keep yourself safe because there's no sort of expert like a psychologist, like a forensic psychologist. There's nothing like that to keep you safe either. All there is a media that doesn't really know how to report on this appropriately, but is telling you lurid shit about every victim. So
it must
all
have been very
this
scary at the time.
Yeah, it was terrifying at the time. People were terrified, especially as the murders go on. You start to hear about how one of the theories is that maybe the murders stopped because it's getting harder at that point because people are terrified, more people are staying in, and other people have started forming vigilante groups. The police are now like on the streets constantly to make sure that any chance to get him doesn't slip by them. So maybe he moves elsewhere. Maybe Jack the Ripper bails on London at that.
I can't say that we're going to solve the crime ourselves tonight.
No,
and as we
probably
discuss
not.
all of these different crimes, we will dip in and out of what happened and where it went, of course. But yeah, please carry on. Sorry, I just thought I'd just make that clear to everyone that Steve might go through a few theories, but I don't know who fucking did it.
Well, I don't either, to be fair. I'll just get that one out of the way. But yeah, one of the theories is that he went into America. He's actually H.H. Holmes, who was a serial killer in America who came years after. One theory that says, that would explain why they stopped in London and then suddenly starts in America. So, there's a number of theories, obviously, over the years. People have posited lots. But at the time, at least, it was terrifying. But at the time, at least, you also start seeing, there's a number of things you start seeing. And again, with the media, the police, development of psychology, you also start seeing vigilante groups. Because people start looking at this point. After a couple of, I think it's after the third murder, people start going, well, if the police aren't going to, we'll do. And, they start taking to the street, challenging people who are out at night in shady streets, whatever. They start taking civil actions against them.
And of course, they must be fueled by this ongoing reporting in the media. This, we see it today much more clearly how a story is picked up, continues for a time before eventually being dropped for something more important. But it, for a while, becomes the focus of the main headline story. From whichever, I'm not going to pick out any particular case to typify that because they all typify it in a way, don't they? So for a while it would have been like a fervor, wouldn't it? Like everyone talking about it, everyone into it, fueled by this every day in the papers. There's more people out on the streets now. So the media had a role there in changing the behaviour of the populace at large, I guess. And it wasn't that they they didn't do it for any sort of ethical or social concern. They just wanted to sell as many papers and fuel the fear, I guess.
Yeah. Again, that sold papers. So even at the like development of capitalism, you're seeing capitalist forces at work. So yeah, we could draw parallels with like the way it works in modern times, but the point is like as the media at the time, they were just printing anything and everything. And at this point, you've also got another weird sort of thing that starts to develop. You have people sending in forgeries, fake. Like I have on my shelf a copy of the Jack the Ripper diaries, which are an infamous forgery, but I think it's a cool little like historical curio. Somebody pretended to be Jack the Ripper. Somebody wrote fan fiction, basically.
I was going to say that counts as media, doesn't it? That counts as
yeah. That came later. Well, that came much later, obviously, but at the time, people were sending in fake letters. You know, the name Jack the Ripper came from a letter sent in that was the first one the police could say this is definitely from the person.
Well, that's a really good point as well. Giving him a name, giving it a. Again, I'll keep picking up as we move through as well. We'll come back to Jack the Ripper a few times, but I'll keep picking up a couple of points. Like in the introduction, I said that I was joking, but the killer goes on to achieve some sort of notoriety and fame while the victims are ended and dead and their stories finish. And so this Jack the Ripper story, it wouldn't be the same without the title of The Ripper, would it?
No, not at all. No, it's a thing that's contributed because it sounds so cool, doesn't it? Jack the Ripper, slayer or killer,
and it elevates the person. I mean, sorry. I was going to say, in doing the action, they changed themselves from one of us normal people to something outside the norm. And so the murder itself, I don't want to say elevates them, but it puts them in a different fucking sphere. It puts them in a different circle. And so now they have this sort of supervillain name attached once they've stepped outside the norm as well.
Yeah, it is almost like creating a character. It is almost like creating a persona, like a public identity or a celebrity. Except that, you're not going to reveal who you actually are. It's not like The Masked Singer, even though I think the crimes are about equivalent. This the element of like this thing is separate, and that also like that reflects a sort of impulse of us to want to otherize it. Because it then sort of like removes not necessarily the responsibility, but it removes the sort of relationship that we have with. And we're going to come back to this later as well. But basically, when you make somebody a serial killer and you elevate them to a different position, not necessarily elevate as better, but you are separating them from society as a whole. You're sort of saying that they're different. They're not human. They're not like us. They're not from a similar set of circumstances. And
totally appropriate on Halloween today. I've got on the screen today a picture of Jeffrey Dahmer's eyes from the Netflix dramatization. He looks like a almost zombie-like cracked eyes. They've almost villainized him and like made him into a sort of Marvel villain in a way. It's this superhuman, I don't want to say positive words, but it's this superhuman thing, isn't it, of like supervillain status that's being given. And in these early days as well, Jack the Ripper was like almost, I suppose, considered like a shadowy, mysterious, is he there, is he not, in the shadows, like having some sort of supernatural quality as well.
Yeah there was a previous what you might call a proto Jack the Ripper. He was called Spring-Heeled Jack.
I've heard of
it. A couple of years previous. Yeah, he was somebody who was said to have terrorized London by like assaulting women of the night, and then leaping great heights and great distances and fleeing into the night. And he is presented in because again, around the time of the media developing, newspapers, cheap books and mass market, novellas and like what we might call penny dreadfuls. Those things become very popular around the time. In depictions there, he's normally portrayed as like almost devilish. Yeah. There's like an element of the horns to him. He's got wings, like leathery bat wings, and usually with a tail. And Jack the Ripper similarly, because there's no real sort of like description of his features or like people drawing, the art for the front page of the paper have really to go on, is that he was in the night. He disappeared quickly. He was in the shadows and then gone. And so you draw somebody over maybe the outline of a hat and a cape and then cover it all in mist, and that's it. And that becomes ethereal. That becomes otherworldly. Yeah. It almost becomes like a Grim Reaper type of fiction.
Far more sinister than just a human being on a street. Now we've got a phantom in menacing the shadows. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, you also have this developing area of science called like biology, and like seriously, the work of Charles Darwin revolutionized the world, and this is one of the areas that's growing, and people sort of like realizing we are human, we are a species, we have traits, we have things that have helped us survive, and painting it like that makes it something different. We don't know what we are capable of as people, but it can't be that. You know, even in this burgeoning industrial city of London, where people are increasingly cramped together and the streets are increasingly smaller because you've just got to get as many people into work the factory, power the industry that keeps the empire running. Even at that point, people are like, we can't be that. Even all the crime and everything that's going on right now in our city, and this institute of justice that not everybody is favoured by, that has to be something that's not human.
I'll throw you a quick curveball here because it's just popped up in my mind. So I would say then that this is, whilst we're almost naturally correct to put this character outside the norm, outside something extraordinary, something different, and therefore it would say that it's not a symptom of our societal norms that people end up just going out killing. This is a malfunction or a glitch in somebody's thinking, or something seriously wrong with someone, and that's why it's recognised by the rest of society, and they're put in this negative box. Like, everyone's happy to say this is wrong, this is bad. No one is putting Jack the Ripper up as a hero and saying, oh, but he's a good winner. Everyone's like afraid, looking to go out and shut him down, get hold of him if they can, but yet he still maintains this sort of almost Dickensian mystique of a real character, a larger than life character, and just to I don't know what question I'm asking really, but just to reiterate that point, that we're seeing it as a negative though, and it's a schism of society and not some product of a naturally occurring humanity. Yeah,
like you said, by like default, you are othering them, because like by their very nature, serial killers are not common, they are rare, so they are an aberration. They are like not representative of the rest of society as a whole. But like as we know now, there are a number of common occurrences in the lives of serial killers that it can be said may indicate that they would have gone that way, you know. But those things are common enough that count for it, you know. It doesn't like explain, like say having an abusive childhood, or being about like Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, Ed Kemper, all. You know, most serial killers will have had tempestuous relationships with their parents, possibly an abusive father, difficult relationship with their mother, and at some point they would have been like left alone earlier at an early age, like 12 or 14, 16, when we would expect, you know, that still a heavy parental involvement in the child's life.
These are socialization years as well, aren't they? So there's some malfunction in the socialization process, I'm thinking.
Yeah. Usually at school, didn't do well, or were like outcasts, were bullied a lot. You know, there's a lot of commonalities in the lives of serial killers.
But it doesn't turn you into a murderer, because otherwise dark side
those things are also common for a lot of other kids that don't go on to become serial killers. So it's very, very difficult to sort of like say, yeah, those are the things, those are the warning signs. It just so happens that those serial killers also had shitty child, for example. So it's not really a common thing, and that you could say is a marker. And you can't find those things because serial killers are so rare. But
I've got a question here.
You have to otherize them because of that.
I've got a question here about the way the police, because we're starting really early doors, and like you said, there wasn't really an effective police force, so they wouldn't have known any of this, so they wouldn't have had any idea about what sort of person to look for. Talking of forensic profiling in the now, do the police use those sort of profiles these days and say we're looking for someone that might be a bit like this?
They do, but not as often as you might think, and usually not to the same extent as is commonly depicted in TV. Like, I got into this because I was ill one night when I was a kid, and my mum let me stay up late, so you know, I was down on the sofa, lying on the sofa. I had a bowl next to me, and she was watching Cracker, and it was the episode To Be a Somebody, which is the one about Hills. And that fucking stayed with me, that show.
That's interesting. That's very much realism as well, isn't it? It's what we're going to go on to talk about in a bit.
Yeah. We can get into that later, because I could gush about Cracker for hours. Yeah. But Yeah, that sort of stayed with me, and it was like that depiction of a forensic profiler is not actually that realistic. It broke my heart to discover.
Right.
But yeah, they are used at times to provide profiles, but it's never like, you know, not done with every crime. And typically, as a forensic psychologist, you would be used elsewhere. You would be talking to victims and to offenders to assess their like capability to stand trial, or whether they are, you know, like how you would help treat them while they were in prison, or you could work with police in other.
Notably, with going back to the Jack the Ripper case and the difference between him and the murderers we're going to come on to in the more modern times, is that we didn't know who did it still. So the next murderer I'm going to bring on in the list, that I've got a rough list, but it's informed by you. So you tell me if there's things we're missing here and you want me to not move on, right? But the next one I've got on the list would be the Black Dahlia, is it? Or would it be... That's in America, isn't it?
Yeah, that's for American.
That's another unsolved one as well, isn't it? There was a woman found dead in a park, and she was quite horribly cut in half. So,
yeah. Again, this is the sort of thing that sort of distinguishes these and media representation compared to people like H.H. Holmes and John Christie, who we'll get onto later. Because those people, we know who did those crimes. We caught them. They confessed. They were found guilty. They were executed. We know who did them. So they stand like through history as examples, but for different reasons. You take lessons from like what the police did differently compared to with the Black Dahlia murder and with Jack the Ripper, because obviously there was something there that led to the discovery of the actual criminal compared to in the other case.
And it's notable to me that, although I don't know much about these cases, the Black Dahlia especially, and I just Wikipedia'd it a little bit, but it's notable to me that the unsolved has some sort of ongoing mystique that is still to this day brought back, looked over, cold cased, and given a name, again, like Jack the Ripper, the Black Dahlia. You know, it's got like a almost Agatha Christie or Sherlock Holmes style title to it, and there's a feel of a murder mystery yet to be solved, and I guess that must intrigue people.
It does, and I think this is one of the things that's key to the whole depiction of murder and serial murder in media, is because sort of it allows us a place to sort of explore this thing. This is a taboo. Killing is taboo. It is rejected by like nearly every society throughout history. It's also a punishment. It's seen as, you know, it is the ultimate sentence in many societies. Death penalty lasts for a long time in history, you know. And there's ways that the public needs to deal with it, because as a society as a whole, it stands against our value that we have established, that murder's bad if it's good. So, you know, if you end life, you are a criminal. You have committed a sin against our society. You have literally transgressed our norms and our laws. So we need to process and deal with them. And ostensibly newspapers like reflect the feel of the country at the time, because they'll write opinion pieces, they'll have letters pages, they'll have quotes from people who are on the scene or live in London, you know, for example, with Jack the Ripper, and those will reflect how people felt. So they become echoing and amplifying the voices of the popular. They become ways for us all to communicate in that respect as well. You could read a newspaper and get a general feel of how people are feeling about this issue, this subject, this case, this murder. And when you look at it like that, the media becomes a place where we can process these traumas collectively, because obviously you'll have like a private feeling about it. Most of us don't know the victims of a murder. Most of us won't have to process that. Some people will, fortunately, but a thing that those people will have to deal with on top of the loss of a person in their life.
Interestingly, when we're interacting with these media pieces, I think I would more often put myself in the position of the victim. You know, when you're thinking what it's like to be, like, when you think through the crimes, whichever we discussed today, I would more normally think, what would it be like if someone was attacking me and I had to try and escape, rather than what would it be like if I was trying to cover up my murder. So, like, I think there is something quite raw, and like when you're reading these things in the newspaper, people are thinking about their own lives and their own experiences as well, aren't they, and how they would deal with these things, I suppose, like you say.
Yeah, especially when it becomes a much bigger sort of case. Your regional newspapers that might carry a story about somebody being killed in a car crash don't carry the same weight as like the Sun and the Mail and the Mirror. All
I suppose we'll come back later as well to the depth of our feelings and stuff. That it will be our final sort of questions about why we interact with this. So I am going to literally cut you off here a little bit because I don't want you to give the goodies away till the end. But give me your next, so we've done a bit of talking about the early days, Victorian times, how newspapers were the biggest thing. We're going to move through to slightly more modern, but still the olden days. Tell me about, is John Christie the next one on the map, the next sort of pin in the map?
Like mid-50s John Christie. There is a couple of like early precedents, but again, you're sort of dependent on the developing state of police forensic science.
Will you tell me what's the next thing, the next time shift that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I would take the jump from like the 1910s, because obviously there's a period after 1910 and before 1950 where the world decided that mass slaughter was we should do it more often.
Yeah, actually, we could have a huge conversation about whether killing people during a war, officially it's not homicide, is it? But it's still murder. So we could have a huge conversation about that, and that's not really what our topic is today. But if you want to talk about that, by all means. But yeah, carry on. Like, that's a really interesting point that you brought up there. During the war, we were killing each other, and it was positive. I think encouraged.
More a result of efforts being focused elsewhere. There isn't much in terms of serial killing and like murder in that period.
Well, there may have been, we could cover the fucking concentration camps and the things they did to the Jewish people, but that's all again within the war, isn't it? And it has a totally different context to just we're walking around on a normal day to day and somebody's decided to fucking drag someone into the woods and murder them. Sorry for me keep swearing and all that, but hello Nut of Fire's Mind in chat. Go ahead, so we'll pick up after the war then when things are a lot better and for some reason people decide to continue with their murdering. Maybe, is that right?
Just not on an industrial scale.
Yeah, just not on an industrial scale, yeah. I suppose actually this is a really fair point to make though, isn't it? That you survive the war. Not like we've all gone through COVID recently, so we all know what it's like to survive something that affects the whole world, and your whole world is called into question. You're worried, and at the end of it, I used to joke with my nan that I was going to get her a T-shirt that said, I survived COVID, and all I got was this fucking T-shirt. But the idea that we've all got through this thing together, there must have been some real traumas in people's minds. Some people must have seen some horrible things in the front lines, and they've come back to normal society. And so the world has been broken apart, but now is to be repaired. And there is a scene of hope, a setting of hope, but amidst a grief that can't be quantified. So it must really affect some people.
It's always worth sort of bearing in mind from our perspective that it's really difficult to appreciate how long it will take to process a trauma on this level, because global wars, these are literally world wars. Most of the world was at war, and they lasted for periods of years. They weren't just quick conflicts that were over in a day or two. They were serious things that went on for a while. So these are generational traumas. These aren't things that are dealt with in a year or two and you're fine. And after, I think there was a period between the First and Second World War where I can recall one Russian serial killer. I think it was Andrei Chikatilo. I might be wrong about that. Generally speaking, that really came into the fore after World War II. When society was rebuilding itself. And at the time, again, you have advances in psychology. 1950s were really where psychology and the idea that the human mind can be understood really takes precedence. During the 10s and the 20s, 30s, you have your behaviorist principles like Pavlov's dogs and the development of Skinner's rabbit box and rat box. And so
I will just quickly say I love the early psychology and the things they discovered, but I hate the fact they did it with the animals, but yeah.
That's fair, but they did also, Little Hands shows that they were not averse to testing on babies as well. So, again, society is developing and ideas about mental health and just the psychology of being human are developing. And you see the shift from World War I, where it's called shell shock, to post-World War II, where it's called post-traumatic stress disorder. In that land, we understand that seeing and being witness and experiencing trauma to that level can indeed have repercussions for a person's mental health.
I suppose it must have been so important to develop these psychological mechanisms because you had a new kind of problem to treat. So,
basically, the Holocaust and Nazism and World War II are also serious points in psychology because they're the points where people start to question man's humanity to man and how far people will go. And from that point on, you start getting experiments like the Stanford prison experiment and
just while you're thinking of the ones, I'll just tell everyone that the Stanford prison experiment was two groups, arbitrarily divided. You just go into you turn up, you're going to be in one of these groups, and they say, all right, you're the prisoners and you're the guards, and we're just going to run a little experiment where you pretend to be prisoners and guards for a few days. It's not going to be anything heavy, and by the end of it, the guards are beating the prisoners and refusing them food and like generally being bad eggs, and it's all predicated on the fact that because you were given the power arbitrarily, you just become a bit of a chuffer, and it turned out that people went along with these sort of behaviours. Lots of interesting stuff. Was it Stanley Milgram? I might be wrong.
Milgram, yeah. It was Milgram. I was still thinking of Skinner in my head, and I'm like, nah, move it on a bit. And it's Stanley Milgram in the obedience experiments where he would tell people to deliver a shock, an escalating voltage, and see how far people would go, whether it would go past the point where it would kill people. And yeah, most people would because they were obeying an authority figure. So the idea of following an authority figure.
And he was very much interested on how the Nazis ended up sending people to, who did what and why and things like that. Yeah.
And you have people like. Forgotten the name again, but there's development of the idea of an authoritarian personality. So and the psychology that might inspire somebody like Hitler or Goering or Hermann Goering. I keep thinking Goering because of Red Dwarf.
But we should actually point out that these people are the like Hitler's probably the most indirectly or maybe even directly one of the most prolific killers of people over the last 200 years. Like
I think it's both like Stalin and Mao.
Yeah,
generally
true.
The name, but
and Pol Pot as well, wasn't he?
Pot,
yeah, actually, there's been quite a few, haven't there? Fuck. Well, we should do a whole episode on them. So maybe we'll move past the genocidal and move back into the personally vindictive. But like, so.
Call a quick attention to the comment that Nutty has made in chat. Do you think World War I and II desensitized society to violence? Which is a very interesting point because from that point on, the way that people handle violence does change. But I think it may be more that it makes them aware of it. And then from then you do get things like psychologists and police trying to ask the question, try to deal with it. You get politicians talking about it, media reporting on it changes because they're aware that shit, serious thing. So I think a lot of it changed. Everything changed with regards to how society perceives, because you've now seen an extent of how far it can go. So I don't think it's less desensitized to it, but more, this is the upper limit, but by like an unintended consequence, other behaviors fall low of that limit. So it just becomes more, not necessarily acceptable, but more, I don't want to say common, but you recognize it when it happens. Maybe there's a bit of like a recency bias or a case of confirmation bias in that when you're looking for it, you see it.
I wonder as well, post-war, I think that's a really good point as well, that literally the physical mechanisms of war, like the guns, the knives, the items were brought back from the front lines and like kept as trophies even. Like there must have been a certain amount of weaponry around the house and home that before a war would not have even been considered to be brought in the house, but suddenly we've just got this mechanics of war just scattered around now as little memorabilia pieces.
And again, the industry to make it en masse. Yeah. Because like a couple of years ago, you needed to be making a lot of it very quickly, whereas now post-war, you don't, but you still have all this industry that you can use to do it. So
I'd like to kind of push us off war if I can and push us into our next notable serial killer. So you tell me unless there's something that you've prepared that I'm pushing you away from, you tell me what's on next.
No. Now that we've shifted past war, we could hit like Reginald Christie. And John Reginald Christie's very infamous case in England, especially because the 1950s, it's known as one of the greatest miscarriage of justice. It's one of the greatest injustices in British criminal history. Right. Because John Reginald Christie had a friend called Timothy Evans, and Timothy came to John with a problem. Timothy's wife was pregnant, and they couldn't afford another child. And John was a former medic in the army, and he said, I can perform abortion. Bring her to me. Perform abortion. And he had her in the house, and he said he slipped a mask on her face. He said, I'm going to mix two chemicals into this thing. They're going to produce a smoke that makes you, it's going to numb it's going to be an anesthetic. It's going to numb the pain that you're
this fella John, who had been a medic in the army, so had seen some probably horrific things that they're going to be bringing you the worst cases to the medics, is now back. He's integrated back into life, and his friend has got a wife who needs an abortion.
At a time when abortion was not legal.
Right, so
in this country.
This would have not been the norm, but people would have maybe considered, like you say, because it was illegal, they would have considered what we would call like a back street, back room. Maybe John would be considered a safe pair of hands being a former army medic in this context.
And he was trusted by Timothy as well. Timothy had known him for a while. He was his landlord. Timothy was...
Because already we're painting quite a strange situation that I find quite hard to imagine myself in. But yeah, like we're looking at someone who's trusted, safe pair of hands, back from the army, and you're taking us to the point where he's put the mask on her face and he's mixing gas. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, basically mixing nitrous in her. But when she passes out, he instead rapes her and kills her, strangles her, because John is a serial killer. And he's been getting away with it for a while. I think by the point he met Timothy Evans and did this on his wife, he had killed 3, maybe 4 people beforehand. And then the thing is that she came with another baby, because again, Timothy and his wife had several other kids. They were like, we can't afford another. That's why they were. And she brought the child with her. The child was in another room while Christie gassed her, raped her, killed her. And then he went and killed the child. And then he contacted Timothy. He contacted Timothy and said, there's been a problem with things here. Your wife has died. I've sent your baby to be taken care of for now, but you need to leave the country, because if they find out why she died, you are going to be in prison. You are going to be in a lot of trouble. So Timothy flees. He flees to Wales, and then after a few days after I think it was actually a few weeks, it might have been up to a month, where he had not heard from John about his daughter, he came back and he went to the police, and he told the police, because he trusted John so much and he wanted to make sure that John didn't get in trouble, he told police that he killed his wife instead. And so when police investigated, and they charged him with the murder, and John testified on the stand against Timothy and convinced the jury that he was a dangerous man who killed his wife.
So at this point, can I just stop you before we find out what actually happens after? Sorry, you were in your flow there.
Well, go.
Yeah. I just want to get it cleared. So at this point, what do the people know outside of this? Like, it's being reported in the papers? It's a big story in the news, in the media?
It's becoming a big story at this time, because this man has been, accused of killing.
We now, in hindsight, know that the murderer is testifying against
an innocent man
who has put himself up there to protect the murderer.
Yeah. Timothy has what we might call now learning difficulties.
Right.
Timothy, not a very smart person. At the time, he was what I think the word they would use was dumb. He was slow. I don't know, but
do get back into your flow and continue with the
Timothy
the courtroom.
was very trusting of John, and he genuinely did want to protect him. He didn't want him to get into any trouble, but he told the police that he killed his wife, and instead of telling them, they went for an abortion, because he didn't know any better. He was very ignorant, and so Timothy ends up on trial. John ends up on the stand testifying against him. The jury believe him. The jury are like swayed by his testimony. They returned a guilty verdict. Timothy is found guilty, sentenced to death, and he's hanged. And then a couple of years later, Christie has moved out of his house. Somebody else has moved in, and they're renovating the kitchen. And as they're stripping the walls, they find a secret door. They find a small door about a couple of feet high, the catwalk.
This must be the worst. Like, if you're ever renovating somewhere and you find a little secret door, I'm sure initially you'd think, oh, this is interesting. But since I know where you're about to go with this now, I've got a guess. I'm thinking this is going to be the worst little secret door. Go ahead.
They find several bodies.
Several?
I think it's 3 bodies all squashed into this like little cubby hole behind the door. And then contacts the police. They start to investigate, and they discover, hey, this is John Christie's house. They bring him in for questioning, and then eventually, they find a lot of evidence that, yeah, this man is what we would call a serial killer now. So he ends up going on trial. He's found guilty. He's hanged, and Timothy Evans gets a posthumous pardon from the government.
That's useful to him, isn't it?
I know, yeah. But
sorry, I should laugh, but it would really fuck me off so much if I was hanged and then later on they get like, I'd rather they didn't give me the pardon. I'd rather just said fuck it, because But
it raises an interesting thing, because a number of not that he went out flirting with the media, but a number of serial killers have found themselves at times where they were either involved with the police.
Oh, of course. Good
or
point.
They were on TV, or
he stood on trial. He was there in front of people. Yeah.
And he presented himself in that way, and that was reported on at the time. Obviously, later on, when the real thing comes out and he's back on trial, it becomes a really big case then.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have things like, I think Richard Ramirez appeared on a dating show. I think of what was the Soham murderer.
Ian Huntley, yeah, he was on the news.
He on TV, he was on the news as well. So it's not unknown for serial killers. And again, you see this Jack the Ripper sending letters to taunt the victims, the BTK killer sending messages to police, and the Night Stalker. No, that was Richard Ramirez, who's the Zodiac killer, leaving coded clues and things. There's like an element of being a serial killer that sort of almost calls out to pushing your luck. Because I suppose you are really pushing your luck by doing this thing in the first place, aren't you? Every potential new victim is also a potential like escapee who's going to report you. So there's always that element of, once you've killed one person, it's one thing, and then once you've killed 5 people, that's another thing. So
yeah, I've always wondered, like, I suppose, to put myself in the mind of the killer, they must prepare and plan and do other things, because I would always think like it would be something happens and then, oh my god, I've got to deal with this situation. But it must be different, like you say. They it's not really a surprise to them, is it, so much?
Well, serial killers tend to sort of go through like a behavioral evolution of increasing increasing ritualization, really, because it's not necessarily that certain behaviors are more extreme than others, but it's more that say you'll get a serial killer that initially just strangles his victims and rapes them, and then you'll get one and then the next victim will be strangled or raped, but they'll also like have their clothes torn,
like an escalation of
the escalation of ritualistic behaviors. So when you're pushing those extremes and sort of realizing with every successive victim, you realize I got away with that. You then need the extra thrill. You then need, something else, because otherwise it's just...
It sounds almost like it's a bit like a hobby.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, almost.
In a weird way.
A lot of them, they did sort of treat it that way. I remember the BTK killer specific would send police messages sort of taunting them. And eventually, after a 20-year period of inactivity, he was caught because somebody sort of like renewed interest in the case. And he got in touch because he was mad about how the papers were reporting on him. And Jack the Ripper did exactly the same thing. Jack the Ripper complained about how the media had been reporting on him in one of his letters.
This is an incredible point to think about, isn't it? That we're talking about the media and their representation. We're going to come on to dramatization a little bit later. But the person who has done the murder, who is at large, is also consuming this media and has a perception on how they're being portrayed, to the point where that, like you say, they're running a risk of being caught, but they're more keen to put their point across. And it seems strange to me that the one person you probably wouldn't want to contact would be the police, but then you're saying that they want to antagonize the police in some way.
No, I don't think. Sometimes some of them would definitely be antagonistic.
To me, the reason I said that is because to me the police are the people that you want to stay away from. So
yeah.
I'm trying to think through the mind of the killer. You want to stay away from the police, but like they're the most interested in you. They're the ones that are looking at you and following it and this and that. So for me to send them something is, for me, it would be like a sort of teasing of them, or like, I'm smarter than you. Look, I can do this under your nose. Here's a letter to show you. Like, sort of, maybe. Is that
Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of serial killers. There's definitely that ego. BTK killer again was one of those people who definitely thought he was smarter than everyone involved. Ed Kemper, I think, is another. He was very sort of like full of himself and like I'm much smarter than this room sort of person. And yeah, a lot of them will see it as almost like a game, almost like a I'm taunting you just to sort of like say, look, I can do it. I can get away with it. You can't stop me. There's maybe like an air of exhilaration to it because you are like you. It's like poking a bear. You really are sort of like poking the people who are trying to catch you and going, you know. So
With John Christie, was he notably dramatized, or was it mainly the newspapers and the? Because at the time it wouldn't have been television so popular, would it? At the time, still.
TV was sort of developing, but yeah, around the time, not every house would have had a TV.
I
It
must
was
say that I
more
went to media college.
radio.
So I've just got a quick say. I went to media college. I did do a module on film, but I'm not like a cinemaphile, so I won't be able to pick. And I didn't. Hand on heart, I didn't do all the research to find out when every piece of media about a murder was ever presented. So I'm just going to ask Steve some random questions, and if he doesn't have the answers, that's fine. I don't expect him to know when the very first television murder thing was produced, but he might do. So you go ahead. Go ahead.
No. The thing about Christie really is that it just sort of it led to the banning of the death penalty in the UK.
Okay, right. We'll talk about that now then. Yeah.
It was because it was because of the media reporting on it, sort of like creating that public pressure of we have just executed an innocent man. Our like system of law is not infallible. So that's the main sort of reason for it. But again, the way that he was presented at first, when he was testifying against Timothy Evans, was that this man served in the army. He's like a community police officer. He's a doctor. He's well trusted by the community. He's very well spoken. Very well spoken. He's very smart. So he's presented as a typical, very upbeat, upstanding member of the community. He is like the quintessential British gentleman. And then, by the time he's actually on trial for murder, very different. A monster. Serial killer. This man has killed multiple women. He was a rapist. He would knock women out, assault them. He murdered people. He's a serial killer. He's a monster. He's another. And so he's gone from the one to the other. And it's again the media, the one that did it. What?
The cat's going. With the death penalty, I want to alight on that a little bit now, since it was the moment that we abandoned it in the UK. It's interesting that we meted out the death penalty for the killer before deciding to abandon it. So at least he got his death penalty before they made that decision. But it was the innocent man that got killed that caused the problem. One thing I always want to bring up about the death penalty, I just want to get out there, is that it seems strange to me that a serial killer can kill multiple people, and then you would say, right, the death penalty is the appropriate for that because they killed, therefore they need to be killed. But you can't it's not that it's justice, because if you kill one person, you get killed, you get murdered, you also die 1 for 1. But if you kill 10 people and then you can't get killed 10 times, there's no sliding scale of justice for the death penalty. So it doesn't actually solve it's not actually an appropriate punishment for that scale of crimes, because it's just it's limited by the fact that you only die once. So I don't know if that makes sense to anyone, or if that makes sense to you, but
I get where you're coming from. For me, it just feels unrepresentative, because especially with serial killers, it will have multiple victims, families affected by that point, and the ostensibly going through a trial and being sentenced is your punishment. It is supposed to be reflective of the punishment of society, but it's also supposed to be restorative to the victims. They are supposed to benefit from it somehow.
Yeah, that's what I mean as well. You can't kill
closure, for example, or some sort of like safety and understanding that the person who has aggrieved you is behind bars. So it's supposed to be restitution to the victim as well.
Yeah, and so you can't bring them back to life by killing the murderer, can you? So it doesn't perform that role. Yeah.
No, but who are we to say that all the members of those families wanted the death penalty? Maybe some members of those family actually wanted to see him in prison for the rest of his natural life, because the death penalty is a definitive end.
Yeah.
But who's to say how long you would live in prison for? If you are committed, if you're sentenced to death at age 50 and then your trials or whatever, you go to the gas chamber or the electric chair or the lethal injection table at 55. That's it. But who's to say that if that didn't happen, you wouldn't then spend, the next 40 years in prison, die at 95? It's very, very... Oh, speaking of Black Mirror, I don't know if it's the same episode, Notifer, but there is an episode of Black Mirror where like a woman wakes up and she's being chased by like killers and people are filming her instead of helping her, and then at the end it's revealed that she's a criminal who's being sentenced to live out this punishment over and over again, and then she has her mind wiped, and then the next day she wakes up, she's found she's being chased. It just repeats over and over again, and that one messed me up, because that is just a brutal display of what happens when the sort of the need for not justice but revenge takes precedence. The need to see somebody suffer rather than to see them punished. And there's like a huge difference there. But we are sort of getting off topic a bit.
I was going to say, yeah, we'll come to the crime and punishment episodes in the future. Yeah. We will. We plan to do a full episode on prison and reform of both prison and people within prison. But it's interesting that it took the murder, the serial killer. It took a serial killer to be caught, and then for one of their victims to stand up for them in court in defence, for the serial killer to testify against them, for them to die unjustly, and then for the serial killer to later be brought to justice for us to abandon the death penalty in the UK. It's all tied up in this John Christie case. Yeah.
It's just, again, it's one of those cases a bit like with James Bulger that we talked about last time. It's one of those cases that changes society. It sort of like has a massive revolution of how society thinks about itself, and it's how it's handling not only punishment and justice and crime, but how it deals with people it considers others. Because again, Christie is a monster serial killer. He is an other.
And so, it's strange, like you said, that he just weeks before was an upstanding member of society that can be, he was seen in a totally different light, and it was the media portrayal of him as a monster that created this lasting... Now when we refer to John Christie, people reflect on him as a monster, and it's that title that's been branded. I mean, by his actions, of course, but the media were the ones to draw the lines, so to speak.
Yeah. I think sort of briefly... still sticking in the 1950s and 60s era, because in the 60s you then start to have more of a focus on cults as hippie counterculture taking acid and LSD and the heavy drug taking, liberal free love, and people like that, people rejecting society and social norms about what is relationship and married and kids. No, we just free love, all that. Hippie counterculture starts to take a thing. People start to look towards more Eastern and Middle Eastern sort of gurus and philosophies, and people start doing like yoga, Buddhism, and all sorts of things start to sort of confluence in that way. You then get the rise of cult and people looking to join, not necessarily cults, but to join groups that will reflect their new way of thinking, or a way of thinking that they are looking to,
And it's upon exactly this. It's upon exactly this that an early Charles Manson finds his new friends, and through drug use and coercion produces murderers rather than doing the acts himself, isn't it? I didn't realise we might be talking about him today, but who's
bridge the gap a bit, because here you have like a period where social development is less on the individual and now more on a group. Now more, how does a group sort of...
I think Manson deserves his own full episode as well. Where's your next?
My next, sort of like around the 70s. Once we jumped Christie, and the next sort of like technological development that allows people to consume this is bridging the sort of like Hitchcock film.
This is what we need to do, isn't it? We need to get back on the track of we're talking about dramatization. So we've had these big characters in the newspapers. But now we're moving on to a new. We had the Queen coronated in England, in the UK. In the UK, we are told that when the Queen was coronated, everyone got a telly, and they all went round the telly and they looked at the telly. And from there on and out, the telly existed. So we'll go from around then, official, when telly started. And we've got cinema as well becoming, post-war, more and more cinema was the media of choice. It was something you went out to do. You didn't have a big screen in your home, did you? So the new films were big blockbusters. Everyone wanted to watch them. And it went from, I know a little bit about cinema, moving from a sort of post-war, we've won the war, everything's great, let's have some colour and light and everything's lovely, to things aren't quite so great, and in the undercurrent of the big city, things are going a bit wrong, and you get neo-noir and detectives and murder and crime, and it becomes a big motif in cinema at this point, doesn't it? So we're starting to move into this world now. Yeah,
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's the point where, up until that point, movies and cinema, you weren't really going for movies. A lot of the focus of cinema was like newsreels, where people would go to get news from the front lines, news from far away, news about new technologies and things. But after that, when the TV starts to become more of a presence in people's lives, and that becomes the main way of getting news, you get your evening news reports, and the radio as well. The radio brings news and broadcast into the family home, and then Dad brings the newspaper home with him. So all these ways of like consuming the world and keeping up with how things are going happen at home. The cinema becomes a place where you go. It becomes a place where you go to escape. You go to see a story. It becomes an event. It's a night out. So that's the point where the media shifts from its like depiction of like realistic in the news and can become more fantastical, because you now have this new way of telling stories. Cinema is not just about the news anymore. It's about, we can tell a story, and it has always been like that. You've always had like that. There's Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and there's been the Nosferatu. You have all the early Vincent Price. You got Hitchcock and all that. So there's always been that element of we could tell a story here, but it starts to shift more because now you've got the news aspect also tying cinema and making it a thing that's either or. It is now specifically for escapism. The stories, it's for tales, it's a night out, it's an event.
And as I say, the initial fervour of post-war victory and getting back to all the good was slowly replaced by this underbelly of it came from post-war detective novels as well, like Raymond Chandler, where you had like crime, gangsters, and this was what was happening in America at the time, so it ended up becoming reflected in cinema. I know as well that you couldn't, this is where we started to get rules on what you could and couldn't show, whether X-rated or showing actual killings or things. They decided instead to show, this is why the language of cinema changed, to show the flash of a gun muzzle and the scream and a cat escaping in the night, and then the allusion to violence instead of the direct violence, and a whole what they call film noir was all born from that, wasn't it? Crime, televised and cinematic crime drama, I suppose, would have become its own genre at this time.
Yeah, because you now have that freedom to tell that story, and rather than keep it realistic, can be fantastical. And just like with the newspapers and the penny dreadfuls, sort of fantastical. So what I'm looking for is sort of like just over the top, a bit more gruesome, a bit more exploitative.
And I suppose this is where these characters like Jack the Ripper, sensational, that's the right word, isn't it? Yeah, and that's where you can understand where it's happened all the way through cinema. Like, it seems like they keep redoing the Ripper story every generation or few generations, and like there were a few. I think Jack the Ripper is a good example, isn't it? Of the story comes back because it's now on the big screen again in a new format. Maybe I can't remember exactly who did Jack the Ripper films, but I'm sure there are Jack the Ripper films in that era. Sorry, I'm I'm throwing curveballs off the cuff now. So
it's good because you got like your media studies and your film studies.
yeah. But where was what?
So after we're done with like the hippie pastel 60s,
give me a murderer, give me a serial killer. Let's focus in on someone that we can example at this time. Did some killing and got in the news.
Right, let's talk about Sutcliffe.
He's got a song for him.
No, it was in Brass Eye.
Right.
An episode of Brass Eye, and people talk about Peter Sutcliffe, the musical.
Right.
Where he comes out at the end, and it's a retelling of his life, and then he comes out at the end and goes, "By the way, I'm very, very sorry." Like, apologize at the end. It's really humor sort of thing, but I fucking love Brass
So
Eyes.
we'll talk about Peter Sutcliffe now, right? And then I'll go back to my list of questions like why decide to make drama when displaying a villain on screen? Do we lose sight of the victims?
Yeah.
All those sort of questions. But we'll first of all talk about an example of it, and then we'll go into my questioning. So go on then. It's Steve on Sutcliffe.
So I don't want to go into it too much because I don't know that much about him. He's not one of my favorite serial killers, as it were. Apparently, you have to have favorites. This line, but again, you almost see like a representation, a repeat of what happened with Jack the Ripper, the way he is portrayed in the media. He's the Yorkshire Ripper, So you immediately have allusions to Jack the Ripper. He committed crimes in a very similar way, strangled and cut. Can't remember how he killed his. Feeling of strangulation might be considered. He's called the Ripper. I'm assuming there was some sort of stabbing and mutilating involved. But he targeted escorts, prostitutes, and similarly people who are vulnerable that the media is not going to give a shit about, parents and the police are not going to give a shit about people who are vulnerable to that sort of offender. So you just have all these like parallels to him. That's why he's called the Yorkshire Ripper. And again, the way the media portrays it is as an other. But at this point, you have psychology. This is the era where the term serial killer like originates from. This is when the FBI starts profiling people. This is when what's the word? What's it? Film? Not the film. There's a Netflix TV series. There's a Netflix series about the guy. I think it was called like Mindhunter. It's about one of the FBI agents first starts sort of like going, why don't we talk to some of the serial killers we've got in prison? Why don't we talk to them to find out what tick? It's that sort of era. And so psychology is developing to a point where there's now maybe an explanation. There's a hint of an explanation. There are new discoveries happening all the time from this burgeoning field of psychology that the media can report on next time there's a serial killer. So again, you're looking at the media portraying them as others and more evidence for, well, actually there might be like some human to them. There might be like some sort of way they grew up or something that's wrong about them, or maybe they had an experience, or maybe there's a bit wrong with their brain. Maybe this bit's not developed, or maybe this bit's too developed. From that point on, it becomes harder to separate the serial killer as another from society, even though obviously by default they are othered. There's still an element of human being brought back into them and an element of society, and that makes it difficult to process because it's like, well, they're a member of society then. They're not another. They're not like an aberration that, oh, look, it can't be us because they were born different. They are now there but for the grace of God. So that makes it even more difficult. So from that point
and
on,
more worry. Sorry to interject. Sorry. I could see that I catched you in flow there, but it's more worrisome almost because before you were worried about a phantom in the shadows who is not the people I know who I can see in the light, but now it could be someone I can see in the light. It could be someone sat next to me on the bus, but before they had to be a phantom in the shadows. Now it could just be the neighbour. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the point. It becomes almost uncomfortably close because when it is a creature, when it is an other, when it's say like your Texas Chainsaw Massacre or your Driller Killers, they're others. They are like monsters. They are like creatures. Your Freddy, your Jason. They are creatures that aren't human, but serial killers are. So the way that people are depicted, the way that serial killers and murderers are depicted in films and in TV shows changes from this point on. They stop becoming monsters, others, and it becomes the focus then shifts onto how are they as people? How did their character develop?
I would also say this is a really poignant moment in cinema as well, where you still get monster flicks to this day. And before that, like you mentioned about Nosferatu, this grotesque cinematic monster, appropriately today's Halloween. You've got all that, but Psycho is like a landmark moment in cinema where the monster turns out not to be something grotesque, and well, it is grotesque, but it turns out not to be something inhuman, but actually some psychologically flawed, quite normal human being, and that in itself is more scary, isn't it? And so we move into this realm of cinema. We're focusing more on the real true crime drama today, but the cinema goes ahead and tells crime stories now with murderers and slashers, like you said, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and things like that. And it's real people are the antagonists in this, rather than something
other, something
Something
inhuman.
phantasmal. Yeah.
Yeah, Psycho was exactly what I was thinking of, because it is the contrast to things like Texas Chainsaw or Driller Killer, things that would otherize the offender. Psycho is just Norman Bates. He is a man who has a disturbed upbringing and a disturbed relationship. But the man is fucked in the head, but he is human.
And he's your first point of contact in the film when you arrive at the hotel. He's there in the film. You're exposed to him, but you're not told he's the killer. You have to either infer it or work it out. You feel creepy, you feel worried, and eventually you think, because he's dressed up as this woman, you think it might not be him, but then it turns out, no, he's just, disturbed. So it's a very normal resolution.
There's a great thematic resonance there, because as the first point of contact, he's essentially your safety. He's your guardian of your safety, because he's the one who owns the motel that you're staying at, gives you your key, shows you to your room, helps you with your luggage. He is like the one who makes you safe in this point where you're supposed to feel safe, and then it turns out, no, he is the killer. He is the danger. He is the one who can, he is the monster.
Very, very interestingly as well, we're at a time where we're sort of saying that in society, these normal people that provide normal roles, like the fella that handles your luggage or gives you your key, has maybe a dark backstory that you're not aware of, and you sort of ignore. Like when you're at the hotel, you don't get to your room and think, I wonder what the receptionist is doing later on. Like, they become non-people almost, because they're performing roles, but they have these deeper backstories. And it's interesting that we're talking about this at the same time as Sutcliffe, who actually was just quite a normal fellow, wasn't he?
He was just a lorry driver. Yeah, he was like a regular bloke. There was nothing about him that stuck out as like inherently monstrous. He looked like, normal for the period of the time. Obviously a bit of a beard, but most men did at that time. He was just normal. He was a regular normal person. Again, like with Psycho, and in terms of cinema, there was nothing to like otherize him the way there was Jack the Ripper. There was no sort of like mystique about him. The police caught him, they knew who he was.
And that maybe made it easier for the police to catch him, because they weren't chasing a phantom in the shadows. They were actually looking for a real human being.
A real person. Yeah. Again, sort of like advances in like police work and forensic science at that point as well that have helped to sort of trace him. Take like casts of footprints, things you collect. What evidence to look for. You've got a better idea of what might happen next because of the way the crime. That sort of, you can infer more from the crime scene, and you're learning. So as the field develops, it becomes not necessarily easy, but easier to sort of trace him and find him and apprehend him. So yeah, there's a lot of things that develop at the time, and again, the way like the media reports it affects it as well. So calling him the Yorkshire Ripper, when it's like affixing gate to anything in it. It's like when it's something that becomes a scandal, it's something gate, whereas it's the same with this. There's probably regional. I know there was a Suffolk Strangler a while, so it tends to be regional most of the time. Because again, it just sort of like isolates it to that area and means like.
And also, once you coin the term Ripper, it has its own folklore. So you don't have to explain what's happening here. You just call them a Ripper, and people go, "Oh, I understand. They're running around at night with the prostitutes and doing these things." And they get the vibe, don't they?
It carries connotations at this point. Yeah. But and again, if you did that in film, you would immediately know what sort of film you were getting. You were getting a phantasmic sort of villain. You were getting another eyes. You were getting like Freddy or a Jason. You weren't getting a Norman Bates.
I don't know if Sutcliffe has been immortalised in drama because again, I'm not a cinephile that's seen everything, but I would say at this time, referring to what we're talking about in the more modern times as well with Dharma and these other dramatizations, this idea that this person that we're looking at through the prism of the media is now not some evil monster phantasmagorical thing. They're actually quite an interesting character, because they're a normal person that's doing very abnormal things, and so they pass under the radar, and we're all worried about peeking through the curtains about could it be this and could it be that. So people have even more piqued interest in discovering, not just through psychological means and insight, now that we're finding out these answers, there's even more interest in the idea of a psychological thriller starts to come up in more, like we said about Psycho, and so I suppose this is where the idea is that these people are interesting characters arises rather than being supervillains. Yeah,
and again, you could just see that through how like various cinema has changed, because obviously you were always going to have those sort of like supervillainy, otherized, villains, as it were, like say Jigsaw, for example. You will always have that sort of thing, but the fact that a new sort of subgenre of this sort of serial killer horror sort of film starts to emerge and develop, and it leads through stuff like Silence of the Lamb, jumping forward a decade or two, but that's not like the next main stop, because then it does become, what's the killer like as a person? What is his psychopathology? What is it that makes him tick? And then it almost becomes like when we were swapping notes and talking about it earlier, you called it like a dance between the offender and the officer.
This is the rise of the police officer and the good guy coming back into the film now, isn't it? And being a protagonist and solving the case. And I suppose with Sutcliffe, it's interesting that the case was actually solved, so then they could tell the story. Whereas with Jack the Ripper, it's an unknown. So,
the unknowns will remain unknowns, but the court are better because you can infer more, because you can ask directly, or you can at least like examine evidence better. But the shift from police as like a protective force, like, because at this point all these things are still sort of relatively the realm of cinema, and TV as its own format, as like weekly serials. Coronation Street and EastEnders have become popular, and so serial TV shows show that people will tune in again and again every week to watch their favorite show. So you get like police stuff like the Sweeney, The Profession, other crime shows.
So now that we're getting onto this, I'll start asking you my questions from my. I'm not interrupting you on your flow, am I?
No.
Because you could have listed endless TV shows.
Yeah.
It's all right. I'm fine. So why? My question to Steve, the forensic psychologist, is to try and dig into some more of these like psychology aspects, I suppose. And one of the first questions is, we're talking about dramas and not documentaries, and I wanted to ask, why do you think drama is chosen as a vehicle for these stories rather than documentary? And is it that we can explore things that we can't see because in documentary you either got things or you haven't. You've either got interviews or you haven't. You've got testimony, you haven't. But in a drama we can explore things, but aren't we trying to tell the truth? So isn't that a bit of a counter? Are people making it up? Why drama?
I suppose. Well, my sort of like, there's obviously going to be several theories about this, but my sort of gut is it's safe, because with a documentary you're carrying like the implicit sort of understanding that everything is true, everything will be based on evidence, everything is factual. It's a documentary, you're documenting everything that happened, so it is assumed and implied that the things you talk about and the things that you show are real and they happen. Whereas a drama, there's a dramatization, so you can be a bit more flexible with it. You can be a bit more allegorical with it. Like, maybe you don't know exactly what happened when a suspect was interviewed at this point, or like when a police officer got home after a particularly long shift. But you can massage those things to tell the story of, like, your devious suspect or your tired and overworked police officer. It allows you to tell those stories in a bit more of a sort of expressive way that gets across a feeling or a vibe or a mood or a sensation, more than an actual documentary just factually laying out a timeline of events. It's a sort of like safe expression of fantasy.
Cat's having a go at it. It's all right.
It's a safe expression. It's a place where you can sort of like explore those themes and those concepts. And maybe if you are doing it in a documentary and you are outlaying like this serial killer killed this many people and all that, in a drama, you can go into it a bit more. You can linger with it a bit longer. You could sort of like explore things like a shot of a serial killer standing over a body can have different connotations depending on how you want to shoot it and what story you want to tell. So it allows us as a society to sort of explore and process those things in a safer way than in a documentary, where you have to consider these people really died. You don't need to think about the victims in a drama. In a documentary, you do. But in a drama, you are removed from that, because ultimately it's dramatization of things. It's for entertainment.
It's in a cinematic language rather than a like in media we've got because you're using the same cameras maybe, but there's the idea of an observational documentary where cinema verite is literally you point the camera at something and it's raw and that's what it is, you see it. But within cinema, someone's made decisions about lighting, camera angles, all sorts of things to create a more comfortable language that you can view these things through then.
Yeah, again, that's like your element of presentation that carries the sort of not necessarily subliminal expectation, but the sort of like implicit understanding that, hey, I'm going to be entertained and watch a story. So ultimately, I'm not that bothered whether it's entirely 100% factual or not. I just want to be entertained.
And of course, it can't ever be 100%, can it? Because are you all right with the cat? Is it all right?
Yeah, she do me head in, yeah, but I'm just leaning over to see the chat.
It can't ever be 100% factual because we don't know, unless the documentary was someone actually had a CCTV camera in the crimes. You know, some elements of them will be dramatized, will be, you know, illustrated through fantasy means, won't they? So then you've got choices in how and why and where you go with it, haven't you? So
yeah, it gives you more freedom as a creator as well, because presumably if you're making a drama about a serial killer, you want to like put across a message about him. You're doing it for, well, I don't know why you'd be doing it, but you'll have your own reasons for doing it, and it won't be to capture the truth or to tell the truth. It'll be to tell a story ultimately. So you'll have that freedom to do as you want, whereas in a documentary, you are tied by the factual events of what happened. And
interestingly, in chat, someone said that it's so people don't get bored and stop watching, and that drama's
Cynically,
entertaining. But also, I know that documentaries can be these days very, very storytelling, very narrative driven. They can be very interesting. But I'm talking about a difference between factual presentation of evidence and the idea that we're sort of taking these. As we talked about before, we took villains from the shadows, and they were phantasmagorical characters that, I don't know if I'm using the right word there, but they were like these monsters. And now we're putting these people, into these monsters, back into the real human form, and we're presenting them on stage and screen as the antagonist, the villain, something to fear, doing something quite horrible. And we're exploring that through this more free, as Steve was saying, like, you know, more free. You got more freedom to explore these different things, and then as like we are entertained by that. We come back to it and we watch it. So it's really interesting to me. My next question would be: when displaying a real life villain on screen, is there a tendency to over dramatize to try and bring back the monster? Do you think?
yeah, but I don't know if that's like just necessarily a result of like the chase for numbers, for viewers, for people keep them entertained and hooked, or whether it's like a result of the format it's presented in, or whether there's like some underlying psychology behind the people who create them to want to do it that way. But I think it's just an inevitability of the sort of content of it, I guess, because if you're making a drama about a serial killer, you know that what gets people talking is the act of the killing, the act of how the serial killer committing his crimes is portrayed. And to get anything more than that, you have to build on it. You have to like say with the Dharma documentary, a lot of it.
Bring up Des. Des, you were mentioning Des was one of your
I want
favourite.
to contrast Des and Dharma.
Yeah,
with
so let's just say quickly who Des is, just so that we can use him for context. He was Dennis Nielsen was a serial killer in the UK, a bit like Dharma, wasn't he?
Yeah, he actually predates Dahmer. It really annoys me when people call him the British Jeffrey Dahmer,
right,
because it actually be the American Dennis Nielsen.
And he was portrayed in a UK television series by the actor David Tennant, and David Tennant held in quite high regard, and it was considered to be a very good series and dramatisation. And so with that context, there was certainly a focus on the character himself. It wasn't just the act of the killing, was it? There was a focus on the character himself and Tennant's portrayal of this person as well, wasn't there, that we were interested in as viewers?
Yeah, because from what my memory recalls, it didn't actually show him killing at all. It all took place after his crimes were discovered. So there was no like flashbacks or anything. The way it was framed was around him in custody. One of the officers investigating the case, which again, you know, because it shows like his family life suffering behind the scenes. And it's like, did that really happen? Yes or no? That might be the drama bit. That might be the fantasy bit. But and then there's also another narrative of an author who wants to write a book about him, so interviews him. And he's a real person. He was a real author who wrote a real book that I've read that's really good. And when I realized who it was when I was watching, I had a proper mark out moment of, oh my God, I've got that book. So, yeah. But the way that Des handled its portrayal of Dennis Nielsen did not go into like the killing, and it did not go into why he did it, and it did not go into like sort of recreating the time when he was in a pub and he met a bloke and took him home and all that. It just showed him as this like really fussy, really irritating human being. He was he was being tolerable because he's such a fussy little shit, and he's one of them who's like always convinced that he was right, and it shows like some level of like delusion and like how far he would go to justify what he did not being wrong, and how he was actually doing these people a favor because he was keeping them off the streets, and it's just, this is about Dennis Nielsen, not if, and but it sort of like also captured this weirdly human side of him because he worried about his dog when he was taken into custody. He was like, he was going to take care of my dog, and we know that happened. We know that when Dennis Nielsen was taken into custody, he was like really, really annoyed about how his dog was and who was treated.
So what I'm hearing from you here is that the enjoyment of this portrayal, like this character study, is the examination and illustration of the psychology that we're interested in, that formed through the 70s and post-war 70s and 80s. Now we're getting, because I'm just referring for context to a more modern piece of media, we're getting into the reasons that like this is good is because we're talking about psychology on screen, really, aren't we? We're examining his psychology.
Yeah, because I mean, ultimately, the question that you have for serial killers is why, isn't it? It's why did you do it? Why? What made you do that? And
yeah, or like how'd you get away with it as well is the other one that I always want. Yeah. But they don't nowadays. They don't tend to. We'll come on to that a little bit later when we talk about police and stuff. But yeah, why and
yeah, and those are sort of like questions that both documentary and drama can sort of like allow us to explore. But a documentary is tied by the evidence. So if there's not much evidence to suggest, oh, this is why you did it, then it's not going to make the cut. Whereas in a drama, that can be proposed as a theory and sort of like explored. But Des sort of like stuck to the fact Dennis Nielsen is portrayed by David Tennant in such a way that is representative of the character and character of the person. Sorry, and as his name's Brian Masters, the author, and apparently he's quite an accurate sort of depiction as well.
I suppose these days drama does want to be accurate as well as dramatic, doesn't it? So it probably holds itself to those standards, I guess.
Well, I mean, like ultimately, truth is stranger than fiction, isn't it? So that, for me at least, would be like my philosophy when if I was coming to make a drama about a serial killer, I would try to be like, no, I'm being as truthful as possible, as accurate as possible. But what Des avoided was going back into his childhood and doing flashbacks. Things like that. It sort of let us infer the psychology and our understanding of Dennis Nielsen as a person from what we saw on screen. It didn't show anything that we wouldn't have access to. Mm-hmm. It showed just, this is how he was in custody. This is how he was when this person came to interview. This is how he was. He was an obstinate prick. He was a knob. He was just this really fussy, finicky. He was in the office where he worked. He was known for being one of them who's like by the rules, doing it, making sure everything, crossing every T and dotting every I and all that stuff. He was that sort of person. He was that sort of finicky, fussy person. And it just portrayed very well. Whereas with Dharma, you have this romanticized sort of like soft focus, like white light, like bright light shot, flashback mode, as well as the actual like post. That was my issue with Dharma. It started at the around, went back.
In a way, is it that with the flashback mode and things like that, you're getting to feel some sort of empathy for the serial killer because you're being put in their shoes when they're going through these horrible things when they're young or whatever? Whereas with Dennis Nielsen and the portrayal there, we're actually being shown him, and we're just getting to dislike him. Like we're like, some films will be to take you along the journey of the hero and to put you alongside them so that you feel good about them and you root for them. Whereas with Des, we're doing the opposite. We're learning that we shouldn't root for him. He's a chuffer. Hello, Snips in chat.
Yeah, basically, because again, like Dharma, calling him Des. Dennis Nielsen had like a pretty shitty childhood. Alcoholic, absent father, problems with his relationship with his mother, early experience of death, overwhelming fear of being abandoned. All those sorts of things that led to him doing what he was doing, but there's just like not really explored in the dramatization of him in like flashback mode. Instead, it's the character telling the person interviewing him, this is what my life's like. So it's less sort of like the possibility for romanticizing it isn't there to the same degree. Serial killer dramatization. I think Bundy was another one that had a similar sort of. Could be wrong about that, but I would be surprised if there's not a dramatization about Ted Bundy point. Either way, they tend to be we'll do the, you know, here he is at this point, then we flash back to him as a child and be, oh look, he's being bullied here, so that's reflective of, and then we flash forward to a scene where he's being, you know, someone's taking the piss out of him and he snaps, and then that link is made and you understand how the childhood experience came to affect the man, and that sort of carries the idea that you are nothing but what you've learned through childhood. You know, you are nothing but the sum total of your parts. You don't have to be accountable for your actions as an adult when your childhood, you know, you had this moment of trauma and that's the thing that affects you to this point. It sort of strips agency from the serial killer to a degree. It sort of like removes it shaves off a little bit of responsibility from it, because not necessarily empathizing with them or portraying them in a sympathetic light, but saying, here is a reason why this behavior might have happened. Here is a thing that we can point at and go, that's why he might have behaved like this now as an adult, because as a child this happened to him. And it's not right for me. It doesn't feel right to me that I think it does strip you of too much of your own personal agency, because ultimately as an adult you're responsible for your own behavior. So, you know, it removes you of that. If you can point back to previous childhood incidents and go, no, this is where I was deprived as a child, or this is where I hurt as a child, so I shouldn't be responsible for it here. But there's that sort of like character building in other dramas, but Des didn't really have that. You also don't get it with, to bring it back to movies, Silence of the Lambs. You know, a lot of Silence of the Lambs is focused on the interplay between Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah.
But you don't sort of like have like flashbacks to Hannibal's childhood or anything like that. Instead, it's left to what's said between them. And I don't recall it actually being discussed that much, because instead they're looking for the Buffalo, they're looking for Buffalo Bill, and so there's not that much focus on why is Hannibal Lecter as he is, you know. So it's an aspect of dramatization that can sort of like affect how a person is portrayed. If you just sort of like portray Dharma chronologically, you might come away with a different impression of him. If you sort of like cut all the flashback bits out of that Netflix show and just portrayed events as they happened, you would come away with a very different idea of who Jeffrey Dahmer was. So it's an aspect that sort of colours dramatizations of people, events.
We don't want to make heroes out of them, but they are the main protagonist, and the biggest actor is cast in that main role as well.
Yeah, exactly. Because everybody, you know, when you talk about Silence of the Lambs, you think of Hannibal Lecter before you think of Clarice Starling, even though Jodie Foster is great. She's not the one who comes to mind first. Anthony Hopkins is, Hannibal Lecter is. And because it's him that's the charismatic one. And that, I think, is a huge part of what goes into why serial killers are so like appealing and enticing as dramatic forces, as antagonists or protagonists. It's charisma. A lot of people, even though like Jeff was a bit weird and Dennis was a bit finicky, they were also charismatic at times. They could switch it on. Jeff was a class clown who would do stupid things and imitate people and try to make people laugh so he could attract and hold attention. And people like again, was it Richard Ramirez who was on the dating show? Very charismatic. Ted Bundy was quite charismatic. I think Ted Bundy drove around college campus picking up girls. Could be wrong about that, but either way,
I think so.
Sure. Most of them, when you hear about serial killers, they're described as charismatic or appealing, attractive. Richard Ramirez is another one. I'm pretty sure I just mentioned. Either way, a lot of Luca Magnotta, again, very charismatic, very not sort of like handsome, but you could see why people would be attracted to him in other circumstances, because people could talk, people could chat.
I was talking about this in chat the other day about confidence to do, just on a totally different subject. I was talking about confidence to do things, because I used to cut hair and you have to literally say, hello, come down, sit in the chair, what would you like me to do today? I'm going to do it. And like, even if you're shy, sometimes you have to step forward in yourself and do things, you know, talk to the people, shake their hands, sit them down, and someone in chat was saying that some people can do that, but it's really difficult for them. It seems to me like the serial killer has maybe, this is just like a curveball again, but has some sort of inner confidence to to kill somebody, to do the murders is a big thing, isn't it? But like you were saying, like they're like this charisma, this ability to walk up to somebody and make something happen, obviously for the negative in what they're doing, but you know, the confidence to at least do it.
Yeah, again, you've got to like be able to talk your victim into getting into your car or coming back home with you, and that takes a certain level of interpersonal confidence in how you interact and relate to people, and how you can talk to them, and whether you can hold a conversation to the point where you can convince somebody to come back to the place. There's got to be some sort of personable aspect to you if you want to be a successful serial killer, because otherwise nobody's going to bother with you and you're not going to be able to attract as many victims.
I feel like we're giving Derek tips now, but that escalation must happen though. People must feel very scared and worried, and then they must feel desensitized to it as they progress. I mean, killers, I mean. Another question I had, but it's an obvious question that I just put in here anyway, is that do we lose sight of the victims? Because at the moment we've been talking about these main people, the killers, and another main person in the story are the people that they kill, but they sometimes become almost anonymous.
Yeah, I think that's an unfortunate thing that happened. Yeah, we do. There's a great book I read a while ago called The Five, which is about the 5 women who were killed by Jack the Ripper. It doesn't go into him and who he might be or anything like that. It looks at them and their lives leading up to when they died. It's a really good book, very well written. But it just sort of represents one of the few things that we still have, one of the many things that we still have to deal with when we come to how we depict these sorts of crimes and criminals on TV and in our movie. What are we going to do about the victims? Because you are talking about real people who actually died. One of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims was a boy called Konarak Synthsaphone. I'm sorry for the butchering of that, but it's Laotian. And he was his brother had actually met Jeffrey Dahmer previously, been assaulted by him, but managed to get away. Nothing really ever came of it. But he went back to Jeffrey Dahmer's place, and he was drugged, he was raped, and then Jeffrey Dahmer was in a period where he wanted to create a living corpse. He wanted to create a zombie. He wanted to create somebody who he could have and hold and who wouldn't leave him. So he was drilling into people's heads and pouring acid into their brains, try and sort of lobotomize them into becoming dependent zombies. While this was happening to Konarak, he got up and he managed to escape Jeffrey's place, and he was found by some girl. And then the police turned up, and Jeff came out, and he convinced the police that he was his boyfriend. We were having a domestic. He was very drunk. He stormed out, but sorry. And the police believed him over the black girls who were telling him, "No, something's fucked up here, mate. This boy's not right. There's something wrong here. He's holding his head. He's bleeding. You know, all this stuff." And the police escorted him back to Jeff's place, and Jeff then killed him. And when you depict that person, somebody has on their IMDb page, "I played a real life victim, serial killer." And you know, they did a good job. I'm no diss on the actor who played the part, but the point is a dramatization of a real murder of a real person, you know, and it's a thing that we don't think about that often, because again, it's slightly uncomfortable. With a drama, you are having some sort of suspension of disbelief. You are expecting that there's some sort of like massaging of event somewhere.
You're introduced.
It might be conversational, or
you've got the titles to start with, and the music, and then you've got your popcorn, and you know you're in a different place than the reality, aren't you? Yeah.
But ultimately, the things that you're talking about are real. The things that you're dramatizing really happen. Some people are playing victims of a murderer, but in a documentary, again, because you have that element of that expectation of truth and objectivity and evidence, and it, you know, it's handled differently there. It can either be handled, you know, in just a very blunt, matter of fact, straightforward way, or you can spend the time to talk about the person and their life up to, and they died. And again, that's something that doesn't really go into that much, because most of the time these people have terrible lives as well. Most of these victims say that this was like what Konarak's living situation was like, but a lot of victims of a lot of serial killers are they're homeless, drug addicts, substance users, they're escorts, sex workers, they're people who are on the fringes of society or the underbelly of society. They're people that the police don't care about, media doesn't care about. Most of their families have either disowned them or they're estranged from them in some way. They're vulnerable people.
They're vulnerable people. Are they chosen by the serial killer for their vulnerability, or is it that they despise these people in some way, or are they easy targets?
It depends on the serial killer.
Okay.
Really, because it could be any of those things. Some people are opportunistic serial killers who will just pick a victim because they're there at the right time. You know, they see I have the chance to grab that person and run, so I'll kick in and do it. Other people stalk their prey and have a specific person in mind. They will like follow them for a while to get their patterns of movement and know when they're safe and when they're vulnerable and when you can get them. Other people are just after like a general type, like it might be escorts, it might be women, might have an issue with women and other figures, usually because of a relationship they've had with their mum where they've been violent or abusive. That's often the link made. So it depends on the serial killer and their individual motivation, but it could be one of those things. It could be many of them. It could be multiple. So, but yeah, generally there's like an element of because they're vulnerable is the main thing. Because if you're picking off just like high society kids or regular people, you're going to be noticed quickly. But if you're picking off like escorts, sex work, you're going to have a much easier time of it because the police aren't really that bothered about them. And society isn't that bothered about them, so nobody really cares when they go missing. Go and watch The Wire, Series 5. Great.
As you walk through the garden, you've better watch your back. I beg your pardon, walk the straight and narrow track. If you walk with Jesus, he'll save your soul. But you've got to keep the devil way down in the hole. So we talked about the victims there. My next question, I've got a little bit of a list, and then once I've done through this list, I'll ask you for your next favourite killer, and we'll keep rolling. My next question is: films are made for entertainment, so is murder entertaining, or is it something about the murderer themselves?
Ooh, I think both. I think. Obviously, when you're talking about a serial killer, you are talking about somebody who was charismatic enough to attract more people into being murdered by. So, you know, there's an element of that person. There's something about them. There's something that we can sort of like examine and look at, and maybe we can discover why people found this person so appealing, so attractive. But there's also the sort of fear of the murder itself, because, again, you're looking at somebody who committed a crime that we as a society abhor, and they did it multiple times, and they didn't get caught. For a long period of time, they didn't get caught. And if it turns out at the end that this was just a regular person who had some mental health that weren't treated or caught at the right time, then who knows how many other people there are out there. It's terrifying. It's horror. It's very dark topic, like darker than a Rob Gavagan list. It's very morbid, and there is an element of that, and there has always been that element right back to when the papers were talking about Jack the Ripper. There was always that element of this is mortality, and it sort of allows us again a free sort of like safe space to go into that and to examine that and to face up to our own sort of like our anticipations of our mortality and what we expect from it and what we would do in that situation. Again, there's a sort of by proxy, like, it's a think piece, isn't it? It's like, what would you do if he came onto you in a club? What would you do if he sort of like stopped you in the street? What would you do if you woke up drugged and sort of semi with it in his apartment? You know, there's that element as well, and that's what allows us to sort of like think in that situation I would do this. So we come away feeling a little bit reassured, a little bit sort of like reaffirmed in our belief that I would do it differently and I would survive. When the reality is we can never know that for sure, but it reassures us that, hey, I've thought about it, I've got a plan. If it comes up again, I am likely to remember.
It's making me think about on Halloween that people all over Twitch are playing horror-themed games, and I've not really been a big horror game player, but again, locating yourself as the person in the game this time who's being stalked, who's being, you know, like, again, like you're being given a chance to feel the thrill of being the potential victim in these horror games quite often, aren't you? There's something about that.
I fucking love horror. I'm not a massive fan of like horror as a film genre, but survival horror I love because it's something about game. Again, this could be like another way of media as represented. Obviously, games are fantastical, and so they're very rarely like Jeffrey Dahmer Simulator or anything like that. But they still sort of like do that same. Here is a space in which you can safely explore that worry, that fear, that anxiety, and sort of reassure yourself to your expectations of your mortality and your capacity to handle a situation like that. You can play and within the confines of a game be hunted and experience the vicarious thrill of being chased or being a victim or being a survivor, and then you can turn off the game and step away and you're like, wow, and your heart's racing and you're like, I need a break, but you've gone through it, you've survived, and when you come away thinking, right, next time if I'm being chased by a killer in a mansion, I'll do this. The next time if I'm being hunted by zombies, I'll do it. Next time if this person or this creature. It's a safe space to sort of reassure yourself. The same way that horror is, the same way that you'll come out of a cinema thinking, well, if Hannibal Lecter sort of came up to me and offered me a drink or whatever, I'd handle it like.
Talking about computer games, the next question I've got is, does the media create criminals? I suppose I could include computer games in that because we enact violence in games, but that's not really the angle I was going for. It was more we're putting these people up on screen. They're real life criminals. We're more sort of focused on in today's episode. They're on the films. They're making films about them. They're the heroic or they're antagonistic characters, but they're the main character in the film. Do younger people look at these things and think, well, you know, these heroic, almost anti-heroes? Do they have their posters on the wall? Does the media create criminals?
That's a question that's long been asked in forensic psychology, and broadly no, because you can't sort of like ascribe one source of media to a person and use it as an explanation for behavior. Like in the 80s when we in the UK had like the video nasty scare, and in America they were talking about like music and heavy metal, and you know there was the Judas Priest trial where the backmasking of and the kids that committed suicide, and I think one of the kids survived and his parents sued the record label and Judas Priest to say like, you backmasked messages in this song and convinced my kids to kill them, and Judas Priest were like, no, we didn't, because we're going to play this backwards and you're not going to hear anything. Played a record backwards, you couldn't really make anything out, and then they said, we're going to do the same thing again and we're going to tell you that you have heard a word, and then they played it and you could hear the word, because the idea has been planted in your head and you're listening for it, so you and that became a huge thing in America. Yeah, the PMRC, and at this point you've got like ratings boards becoming a thing and like age ratings becoming a thing, and the idea that these forms of media are not just for like the family as a unit, or they're not just like kids shows or whatever, they're things that can be enjoyed by adults as well. So get a sort of growth of horror and gore and sort of like shock. You know, you get these things that are growing and you're like, oh, adults only. And then as a kid, when you're seeing like stuff like that, you think something to that, it becomes alluring because it's forbidden, it's an adult thing. But for adults, it's like you say, space of expression, and it's your thrill and all that. But from that point on, even to like the mid 90s, when you had Doom and Mortal Kombat, and people were looking at it for shootings in America after Columbine, not really a thing that you could say, because there's just too many people doing it that don't. Too many people watching horror movies and playing Doom and violent video games and listening to heavy metal that don't go on to be serial killers or school shooters.
That's a good point, isn't it? Media's so pervasive that if it were to be producing these characters in our societies, then they would be produced far more frequently.
Yeah. And far more earlier as well. You know, maybe it is like with video games because of like the graphical technology available at the time, but certainly you've been able to film something since the advent of cameras. So, you know, if horror movies and violence on screen made people serial killers, it would have been much earlier and much greater. But yeah, broadly that. It's more likely that these are serial killers. Let me finish my point. That these are serial killers who just happen to watch horror movies than they are horror movie fans who became serial killers.
There was an argument that made recently about video game violence, that violent people navigate towards violent games rather than violent games create violent people. So I could agree with that. Yeah. Before I move us on to YouTube, we've been running we're coming up on 2 hours, so we're good for time. Everything's cool. Yeah. How's your cat? She all right?
Outside, but she's being a pain in the...
Okay. If you need to do anything, just let me know, and we can. Do
no,
she's
been fed and everything. She's fine. She's just in and out.
Okay. The only questions I didn't ask in that list there was what makes an interesting criminal and what kinds of criminals have been dramatized and with what kind of reception. Have you got anything big on that I'm going to leave alone, or do you want to go on that?
Well, so for the idea of like what makes an interesting criminal, we sort of brushed over it with charisma, because there's always got to be something appealing to a criminal.
That's what I was going to say. I feel like you've talked about it a bit, but if you want...
But I did want to sort of go over your other point of what sort of criminals have been dramatized, because mainly we've been sticking to serial killers.
Yeah.
And sort of like your occasional one-off murderer. But there's all sorts of crime has been depicted on TV and film, and things like gangster movies and like heist films tend to glorify gangsters and robbers as sort of like modern day comic Robin Hoods. Like, think of something like your Cockney gangster, like saying Snatch or Lock, Stock, something that Guy Ritchie would have done. Or you've got like your heist movies like Ocean 11, Fast and the Furious, and these are people that sort of skirt society's edges. Again, there's something outsider about them. There's something subcultural about them. They're not sort of like representative of the majority of people in society, but they are sort of rebelling in that way. They sort of carry on the idea of, we come from an East End town, we come from a street where everybody had the door open and you respected your mother and all this stuff. And, you're sort of like almost Robin Hood-esque.
It's like we've created a subculture almost.
Yeah, basically. Own, these like, again, these are real places. These are real people. It's usually sort of obviously not like something like Snatch or Lock, Stock. But if you think about, what's the one? The guy who played Bane in the Batman films played the Cray twins.
Right.
Was it Ronnie and Reggie or something? But again, it's a dramatization of real people, real events.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about this. When you mention the Cray twins, I always think of them as gangsters, suits. The murder's not the first association that comes to mind, but of course I don't know exactly who was committed in what act of murder, but they were involved in murder. Right.
Yeah, but they were involved in a lot of criminal activity. It's not primarily... Oh,
yeah, general crime as well. Sorry. General crime, yeah.
So, they were gangsters, they were criminals.
Oh, God, yeah. So, and I was sticking, because with my questioning, I was sticking to real people as well. But like you say, general crime, real people. It's getting in my head now what you're saying. Like, they're not villains. They're anti-heroes. They're the protagonists now. They're, like you say, outside of society, but for noble reasons. And the Robin Hood thing is that Robin Hood robbed from the rich to give to the poor, and so we are now to side with the villain. And to when you become emotionally invested in a character in a film, you're going to become emotionally invested in these lovable rogues. Yeah,
the lovable rogue is the thing. Think about that sort of Cockney ideal. It is mainly Cockney there, although the lovable rogue.
We've got them in the
We're
British we've got them in the Peaky Blinders in the Midlands as well. Yeah. We've got them in Birmingham, mate.
Again, a real crime, a real gang that actually existed at the time. Real sort of dramatization. That sort of lovable rogue ideal comes back. Sort of like say, look, again, they're humanized. They are outside of society, but now you have the extra layer of moral stances. They're not just like criminals. They're not just psychopaths. They're not people who are othered. They are regular people taking a moral stance against some sort of social norm.
It reminds
me of
when
attitude of robbing from the rich.
It reminds me my granddad used to talk about the great train robbers. And he didn't used to tell me the stories. He was a good man, my granddad. He had noble, heart, and he was a good man. But he used to, tell me this sort of story as in they got away with millions. Like lucky them, rather than like these terrible people performing a robbery. So there was almost a sort of like a winning the lottery sense to some of these crimes. These heist movies as well, criminals in that. Sorry, do go on if I'm interrupting you from your flow or
Oh,
your
yeah,
cat.
no, you're hitting the point. You're hitting exactly the point that way to make it. It's like people like the Cray twins, the Great Train Robbery, the Hatton Garden heist for a more recent example, DB Cooper in the 70s who stole like a fortune and just disappeared. You know, these people are seen as anti-heroes because they've robbed from the rich and they've done it. They've got away. The people sort of like suddenly forget the giving to the poor bit afterwards. But the point is that these
But they represent the poor. They've come from the poor.
They
are the poor.
Exactly. Yeah. Ronnie and Rick, the Cray twins. Shockingly gave away a bit of ignorance there. The Cray twins were not rich. They didn't come from upper class society. They were poor working class lads. You know, the Peaky Blinders were not rich people. They were working class. And
this is your way of sort of going around the side door and not following society's rules, but being successful in your own right with your own rules, and you know, financially as well as socially and status. Like,
yeah. It's about sort of like the betterment of it. You're seen as being moral because you're doing it for the betterment of yourself and to sort of like move your position and your comfort in society up. Just because you're being frustrated doing it through regular legal means.
And this goes right back to The Wire again, doesn't it? Because I don't remember which season it is, but we talk about like they don't have options, and it's their like Stringer Bell himself represents this, trying to cross over into the acceptable sanitized world, and in the end he can't do it, can he? And you like you have a hierarchy like a business, but it's a black market, so they're criminals.
I used The Wire a lot in an earlier video I did about causations of crime and criminal behavior, because just so many points of that. But yeah, it's series 3 where Stringer and Avon are having a disagreement about legitimacy or being gangsters. Avon has the great line of, you know, if I cut you, you're green, you bleed green, and if you cut me, I bleed red. Yeah, it's just great. That's a great scene. It's a great series. Series 3, that bit.
Yeah, we should do an episode or two on The Wire, shouldn't we? Yeah.
Let's fucking do it. But yeah, again, you're seeing that sort of anti-hero personality come up in The Wire with how they depict. These are drug dealers. These are gangsters. These are criminals. These are people who will execute people. You know, these aren't nice people, but they are portrayed in a way that sort of shows the human side of them as well. These aren't rich people. They're not aberrations. They're not monsters or others. They're people. They're people coming from circumstances that a lot of people in this world will be experiencing. So it puts it right back there. It removes sort of expectation of evidence and that like a documentary carries. But it still puts it in a place that can resonate with people and allows you to experience it that way. So you can explore well, if I was growing up in those towers, what's to say that I wouldn't end up like one of the kids or stood on a corner, you know? So it sort of humanizes it, but doesn't really sort of like couch by the way, they're also gangsters. It just shows that as well. It shows death in The Wire is a thing that stuck with me because it's always quick. It's always silent as well. Like the moment somebody's shot, there's normally a fluttering of sound, like everybody runs. And all you can hear is dogs barking in the distance. And it's really quick. It doesn't linger. It doesn't sort of like make a big thing out of it. It's just there. It's brutal and it's reality. It's not like drawn out like a serial killer's one would be ritualistic and there'd be a slow time and a long time taken with the corpse. And you'd have like lingering shots, cutting down, putting in the wash, moving blood, wiping away blood and all that. It's really just straight and blunt and to the point, so it's shocking by default, by like comparison to me.
And The Wire stands out because it reflects society, but it isn't. It's not. It's based on true stories, but it isn't true stories. But it's based on, but to the point where some of the actors actually are people that lived in those situations in Baltimore and lived through them, and some of the stories they tell are real stories. And the names, there is actually a real gangster in Baltimore.
Padre, isn't he? He plays like the Padre.
But I mean, as well, the names, like there's a real gangster called Bodie Barksdale that was head of a crew, but they separate his character out into different characters for different. You know, it's not the one real story, but it is a reflection of real stories, isn't it? Yeah, and like you say, the actors that live the world are in it as well. Yeah. Yeah,
it's very sort of like informed by David Simon's time as like a homicide detective and a reporter. Sorry.
And he did Homicide: Life on the Street.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that when you watch that back after you've watched The Wire, you see a lot of things that were seeded in that, don't you? And that detective actually has a cameo in The Wire, and he's in the bar having a little drink, and he
Oh yeah,
McNulty
yeah, yeah.
talks to him just briefly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. This leads me up, before we get on to the final sort of set of questions about YouTube and the now, and maybe you want to do, you've probably got some other bits that I haven't covered that you might want to like tell me that I haven't covered and dig out or whatever, but I've got another question here that's another, like, I haven't prepared you for it, it's a bit of a curveball, but has homicide changed over the years? Because police work certainly has.
Oh, interesting.
Just off the top of your head, you know.
Yeah, because like when you look at like the Victorian era, most of them were poisoning. Most of like your crimes and your criminals did it through poisoning. Jack the Ripper was an aberration because he stabbed, he mutated that way. But most of them, Crippen was a poisoner, H.H. Holmes was a poisoner, Reginald Christie was a poisoner, technically, gasp. Granted, he strangled and killed, but still. So a lot of the time it was poison, and then as obviously like the restriction of chemicals became more tense and secure, and it became harder for people to easily obtain something like arsenic or rat poison from the chemist. It shifts, and so you end up getting like stabbings and shootings. And again, mostly in America with serial killers, it tends to be either like a ritualized one or an opportunity one.
In America, you've got a lot more guns, of course. In the UK, we don't have so many guns, but the serial killers aren't using them.
No, because things like strangulation are intimate. With a gun, you could be at a faraway distance. It's quick. It's one shot, and then you walk away. But having your victim in your hands and strangling them takes a long time. You have to be very, very close to the victim as you're doing it. It's an intimacy to it, and that sort of like elevates it beyond just like a drive-by or a random killing, or an argument that got out of hand. It becomes something different there because there's that level of connection to the victim. It takes a while to strangle somebody to death. It takes a lot of force. And that's why serial killers tend to not use guns, because it's over too quickly. The thrill of killing somebody and like the whatever feeling they get from doing what they're doing disappears in an instant with a gun. But gangsters and things like that, where it needs to be quick, you need to, stop by a corner, shoot somebody, and then go before you're caught. Guns are fine. Guns are perfectly serviceable. For a mass killer who needs to kill a lot of people very quickly, guns are great. We don't get that many mass shootings over here in the UK. So mass killers aren't really a thing, but it does happen every now and then. You'll get people will like drive a van through a crowded street, or stab whoever they can in the street before they're stopped. Things like that. Terrorism and the way that we reported terrorism has always been a thing, but again, that's sort of neither here nor there for what we're talking about. So you could make a case for it, because again, mostly terrorism involves,
it's a more specific niche variant of homicide. Yeah.
But again, you do get the similar
but you still need the same means and you still need the tools, and you need to achieve the same ends, I suppose. So
yeah. So there's like different methods of doing it as a terrorist, but typically it tends to be to strike an object, a place, rather than an individual person. So you facilitate it differently. But you could make the case for it, because again, just like gangs, people join terrorist groups for various reasons of like identity, belief, psychology that they get from it. But the way they're depicted in film as well changes, especially post 9/11, where all of a sudden you've got a bunch of films and games that are like, wow, militarism is the best, and terrorists become just sort of like an ineffable sort of group of people who normally have a headscarf on and a vaguely Middle Eastern thing and an AK-47.
And now we've got some baddies.
Now we've got a group of baddies, whereas previously that used to be Russians or Nazis. For us, that would be like
that makes
up
sense,
to the end of the Cold War, Russians, Nazis. But now we have a new face of fear. We have a new place to express, to project all our worries and our fears about us in the world, us as a society, our place within society, all that stuff we can project onto.
And going back to serial killers and like the theme of today about criminals in drama. So the enemy there is within. It's not like, it's again like this thing about safety of like being able to point outwards and say they're out there, they're away in this other country, but the serial killers are within, aren't they? We were talking just as well about how murder's changed over the years. So you were saying poisoning's gone out of fashion because you can't get access to poison, but murderers like this that we're talking about, they like the process of doing it and it being personal, so they don't want to use the guns. So they like the trend has been towards strangulation and stabbings and other mutilations like that. Has it changed with the police's ability to, you know, DNA evidence, things like that? Has there been more of a modernization of murder, do you think, to avoid those being caught?
Those detections and those sort of like developments are always pushed by like changes in killing. And so, you know, ballistics technology and ballistic forensic sciences are sort of like chased by the proliferation of guns, for example. You need to know how to identify which gun a bullet came from because so many people are using guns to kill people. So that development comes from a need. So as the way people kill shift, so too does the way police investigate it and the way that it's tested and assessed.
And then the people change the way they kill because they know that they're being tested for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you have people who are like, suddenly we can detect fingerprints on like glass and cups and things. We can detect fingerprints at the crime scene. So people start wearing gloves. Some criminals start wearing gloves. Other criminals start committing crimes from places where they can't be fingerprinted, say like in a car. You drive up to someone and shoot out the window. You're not going to leave a fingerprint anywhere at the scene. You're going to drive off. So changes in the way that criminals commit those crimes and the way that the way that serial killers go and kill it does facilitate forensic sciences, forensic investigations in that way. So it does change the police's investigations of it. So look at stuff like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who would, you know, leave bombing packages around. That changed how the police handled stuff being sent through the mail, which then affects later on after 9/11 when anthrax starts getting sent through the mail. That never became as big of an issue as it could be because the police had the ability to find suspect packages, stop them, you know. And again, I think recently there was I could be wrong about this, but it was a couple of years ago when somebody was planning to send bombs to members of Congress and they were found stopped. I think one of them was Nancy, what's her name?
Pelosi.
Yes, Nancy Pelosi. Could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that was a couple of years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Might be. But still, the point is that the police. You don't hear much about people sending mail bombs anymore because it's difficult to send. It's not only difficult to get the facilities and the stuff that you need to make a letter bomb, but it's also difficult to get it sent through the post to your victim.
So in the general sense, we're saying that criminality comes up with a novel way to create mayhem or do a crime, and then the police find a way of detecting it and navigating it and that. But the world of the more personal serial killer, the more dramatized character, that world is still, other than sort of gloves and avoiding DNA evidence, that's still a very personal, very brutal and old-fashioned way of killing.
Yeah, because again, the joy is more or less, or the thrill is more or less taken from the moment of killing, the way that somebody is as they are dying, and you don't get that with a gunshot to the head or, you know, somebody being run over or pushed from a great height. There's instant means of death are less satisfying to serial killers, so they tend to not take them as much. There's something that serial killers get from killing, whereas other crimes and other criminal behaviors that involve killing tend to be quicker because they need to be by design, by virtue of being the need to kill. Like wiping out another gang is you just do it quickly. You do it quickly because there's less chance of getting caught, there's less chance of you getting killed. So you get in there, you do it, you go. So guns are perfect for that. You're spree killer, which we've sort of not talked about as much, but it never feels right in America because you can guarantee you talk about like a mass shooting and
there's one about to happen. Yeah.
So,
maybe we should cover things like that. Again, that seems like a very niche, different kind of crime than
plus
we're talking about.
I suppose because they are such a commonly occurring thing in America, at least, they're not subject to as much sort of dramatization, because the people, like, say you're dramatizing
You'd have
a
to get
serial.
children to play the roles as well, which would be fucking
Yeah.
awful for the children.
Yeah, because if you're dramatizing like a serial killer from the 70s and the 80s, sorry, you know, there's only so many people involved in that case, including
it's
like,
not
victims
raw.
and the family. It's not raw, and it's also not that common. Serial killing is not that common, so it's a thing that most people can watch a drama about and not feel aggrieved or upset or affected by in any way, you know, because most of us are not going to have to deal with the process of I know somebody
Sorry,
was killed by.
I'm laughing, but if you've been affected by the events in today's show, or if you yourself have been murdered, then please call the line. If you yourself have been
You
murdered.
get at the end of like a Channel 4 documentary.
Yeah.
If you've been affected by the issues raised in this program, please call this helpline.
If you yourself have been affected by murder or know someone that's been murdered, then please call 999 immediately and just fucking what you do. Anyway, sorry.
But statistically, more people in America will have to deal with being with knowing somebody who was killed in a mass shooting than they will knowing somebody who was killed by a serial killer. So it's a more popular as in terms of the wider spread. It's a more populous thing. It happens more often. It's a more common thing. So it's harder to sort of dramatize with the idea that you could put this out and then the very same day somebody goes and shoots up a restaurant or a school or a fairground park or whatever.
So I guess the appetite from the production side, like regardless of the appetite from the audience, there's a balance there as well, isn't there? Because you're treading on dangerous political grounds maybe as well. And in America, you've got these two sides of the political argument where the guns are positive and negative is reflected in the way they report these stories and talk about them. So it gets very intertwined with politics as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a rare opportunity, as it were, to sort of see it as an example of how media reporting can actually affect the crime. Because unlike with reporting about serial killers, when you report about mass shootings, typically there is a copycat crime within, I think the period is about 2 weeks. There's a way of reporting. I've seen media recommendations of how you should ideally report mass shootings. And it's you downplay it. You keep the story local. You don't lead with it on your main news. You don't start it off with flashing lights and sirens and the peace was shattered today in the quiet town of, you don't do anything like that. And if you can consider for an English case, because obviously we're not American, so we can't really comment that much, but there is an English equivalent that we can draw, which is Raoul Moat.
Mm-hmm.
If you remember when Raoul Moat went nuts with the gun and then
I'm so colloquial sometimes. We're presenting a podcast. I should say, Raoul Moat had a mental disturbance and decided to take it upon himself to roam the rural town.
Yeah, it was a rural
with a shotgun. It's similar to American shootings, but the shotgun's not able to discharge as many bullets as frequently. So some people were shot and murdered, weren't they? But
if I remember correctly, he shot his ex and her new partner,
right?
Who was, I think, they were a police officer, and then he went on the run.
Yeah, rampage.
He was found. He was last reported in a rural village called Rothbury, and the media fucking swarmed this place. They interviewed basically everybody, every village. We're talking small rural village, so you have got roads out of town. You've got a little bridge and then a path, and then you a road down a dirt path, and you're out of town. And there would be media everywhere. There would be police cordoning places off, and then there'd be media. There'd be reporters from the BBC and ITV and Sky, and they'd all be stood there. And Sky would have the drones flying overhead, and people would be getting updates, and they'd be interviewing the people in the shops and the people that live there. Go, what's it like living here right now when he's out there in the forest and all that stuff? And it ultimately sort of not that it made the situation worse, because obviously the situation ended how it would, and there wasn't a copycat if following that, but the media reported it in a way that really you shouldn't, because it completely glorifies.
It's very interesting what you're saying. Whether the media create criminals, we asked earlier in a different context, but this is where an insensitive way of handling a story can have unintended consequence in the audience that are receiving it. And that unintended consequence, as you say, if you lead with the story as a I'm just trying to repeat back to you what I've just learned from you, is that if you lead with the story in a sort of glamorizing way, because you are the media and people refer to the media for all the other sorts of stuff, whether it be Kanye West or the Kardashians or now a big school shooting, you're top line media. So that puts you in a position that people want to be in, and whether it's a negative reason to be in it, people seem to have reason to emulate it. They copy that. Yeah.
If I remember correctly, I am just checking the date because I think Raoul Moat came before this, and not to say that this was actually a copycat. Yes, he did. Not that it was exactly a copycat crime, but there was another gunman in England called Dale Cregan.
Right, yeah, I've heard that name. Yeah,
he was the one who shot the 2 police officers.
Yes, yeah. He was he missing an eye?
Yeah, one eye. Yeah. But yeah. Again, he didn't like go out the same way that Raoul Moat did, but again, murdered with a gun, went on the run, was captured by the police eventually. But the reporting was very different to Raoul Moat because he didn't have that whole running and hiding and sort of like getting away with it thing. He was like, the moment it happened, the police were on it and they were after him. And the media was told, stop reporting like this, don't report like this, don't mention this. Because we don't want to give information away.
I'll tell you something else as well. We're in a very different world, in the very modern world now, with Dale Cregan, or Cregan was it? I don't know. Anyway, he comes from a world of criminality, gangster, but the actual reality of gangsters, unlike the films we were discussing earlier, The Lovable Rogue, The Lovable Murderer, as said the cat ballyhoo in the chat there, the Lovable Rogues, it's not so lovable, it's more real and raw, and there's drug crime and street crime and murder, and so the fact that this person decided to choose police officers as his victims in his world or his social hierarchy wasn't necessarily seen in the same negative light as we would see it, because they were chosen as enemy opposition police officers, maybe. Is that right? Or have I got that wrong? Maybe.
No, you're right. He was like a gangland. So I don't want to say boss, but he was gangster. He was sort of like associated with criminality, and those victims were chosen because they were police officers. He called the police to his house to ambush.
Yeah, that was it. Ambush the police, didn't he? Yeah. So he
was chosen because of where he was from.
And whilst we discussed all these sort of ideas, that is a very I don't quite know what to say about it really, but it's like the consequence of where we've got to now, isn't it? Whether people watch the films or don't, or love the rogues or don't, like the reality of crime on the street is it's a bit more real, and it's not like The Wire, and you know, in reality it's a bit more harsh and brutal, I suppose.
Yeah, but again, dramatization allows us to avoid all that because it's an uncomfortable thing. The thing that I had an issue with forensic psychology when I was studying it was that you were given warnings about, hey, like this week we're going to be talking about, you know, how the police and how the courts handle sexual assault, for example. So, you know, just a fair warning, the content matter that we'll be talking about is very, very dark. It's very difficult, and if you don't want to deal with it, we'll understand. You don't want to. We understand. So you were given warnings, but it was not couched in any sort of like comforting or preparing. It wasn't. You weren't braced for it. Basically, you were just laid. It was just laid out up front. This is what the crime entails. This is what these people did. This is how it went down for the victims. You know. And
so you're given the facts, but they're not, because it's not dramatized in any way. Anyway, you're not given any sort of cushioning as well. You're just given the facts.
Yeah, basically, yeah. It's hard to be like as clinical as possible because you have to. But it's a really difficult thing to sort of process as you're going through it, because you are constantly aware that these are things that happened. And when I did like my final,
like horrible, sorry to interrupt, but in crimes, there's a process, things happen over time. But when you learn facts, like this is something that we're going to come onto YouTube. Like we're running a little long today, if that's all right with you. But when we come onto YouTube, this will be part of this conversation as well, which we're having just literally a second. But is that you have to receive all this information quite in one big burst, and like you don't necessarily, with YouTube you can pause it, but you know you're learning all these facts like one by all at once. It's like overload sometimes with some of these horrible things, because you're repulsed, you're reviled, but you have to sort of, instead of turn away, you have to keep looking. Do you know what I mean? Is there an element of that maybe?
Yeah, yeah, it makes it difficult to deal with because you are coming from a place where you could pause your true crime podcast, or you could pause your documentary, or your dramatization, and you could take some time to deal with it, and you could go do something else. But here in your lecture hall, when you're being told about this crime, this case, this actually happened, you have to sort of like take it in and keep going. And later on, when you're like, you're done with your lecture, you can go for a break or a coffee or a fag or whatever. You're like, that was wild. That I'd sort of really process it, but at the time, you just have to keep going. There are a couple of lectures about a couple of things where I was thinking, I'll be all right in this one. Like when we were talking about stalking, I thought, oh, I'll be fine. I won't need to worry about material. But there was stuff in there that really got me, and I needed to take a break out. And like the sexual assault ones and the murder. The murder one wasn't too bad because you talk about murder in a lot of different contexts. So it's not like one unit or anything, or one lecture. It comes up multiple times, but sometimes you would go into specific things. So like sexual assault would be a specific lecture because you need to talk about it in this context, get it out of the way, and like prepare people. So it's not cropping up later on when you're talking about, say, membership of a terrorist organization or a gang, and then all of a sudden somebody's talking about sexual assault and sexual assaults. It's here in this context, so you need to be aware that you can deal with it, but it's still something that's really difficult to process. I remember because you go to see like actual like crimes as well. We went to see like criminals being sentenced at Crown Court in Manchester. So you go and see these things happening, and you're aware these are real things. Like the real things. They don't like, you don't have the sheen of a dramatization of a serial killer to sort of like go, wow, that was, what a tale. God, the things that he went through. God, the things that we just saw. It's real, and it's a difficult thing to deal with, and it leads to difficult conversations about very difficult subjects. When you say, if you have to discuss a crime that happens and suddenly takes over the country, one of the big crimes, say like Soham or James Bulger, something like that. If something like that, and you were talking about it, people who hadn't gone through like a forensic psychology course and sort of only had like your news and your dramatization understanding of the events and how things were. As a forensic psychologist, you have to go like, well, actually, here's why these things happen. Here's why they don't get sentenced this way. Here's why we don't have a death penalty. All that stuff, and it just makes it hard. Oh. So yeah, can we move on to YouTube?
Yeah, let's move on to YouTube then. So I'll tell you something else as well quickly that you can't hear, is that my Dark Souls music paused itself at some point, and so we were talking without music. I've tried to put it back on. It might seem inconsistent to people that suddenly there is some background music and suddenly there isn't. I'm going to leave it running if it's not too intrusive, and I'm sorry to everyone who feels it was inappropriate that background music started back up during some conversation about something serious like that. Yeah, I will say just before we move on to YouTube, though, I totally understand, though, is that what you're saying is that when these things happen with the rest of society all at once, where we're all consuming the media, we're all seeing in the news about this crime that's happened, you have a different level that you're operating on, and so you're seeing like through the veil to something darker, maybe something more brutal, and that what you were saying to me there is that in some way you kind of maybe feel you have to carry that on your own. Or in some way that this is really interesting. In some way, the criminal is othered, but you as person who is engaged in catching criminal or identifying criminal or whatever is also in some way othered by this deeper knowledge, this sort of
it's not like industry bullshit. Basically, it's like do you imagine that there's a story about like a skyscraper on fire, and they're there on the ground floor talking to the firemen, and like, we got in this situation. However, it's difficult because the height and the wind and the temperature and all this. So they're talking about stuff, and most people are like, "Wow, that's a really dangerous situation those firemen are put in." Aren't they brave? But other firemen, like around the country, watching and understanding that difficulty, they're like, "Oh God, you mean the wind's reaching that speed, or the temperature's that high at that floor, and can't reach." So they'll know like the pressure of the that the firemen are under. They'll know like how important it is to get like the ladders reaching a certain height or something like that. It's not necessarily a burden, but it's fucking annoying because you can't switch it off. And
also when people have these conversations like with the media, some people, not everyone, but some people seem to hear what they've heard and then sort of talk about it into certain levels, and then that's it. Like, that's what we've heard, we've talked about, we've said it back to other people. like we're okay with that. That's the story. That's the whole point of this media and this narrative. But you're saying that like you want to talk about things that go deeper and further, and then maybe my guess is just that other people around say like, wow, okay. Anyway, so on the other page on the news, it says this about the football, and like, no, wait, we haven't finished with talking about how this, and this, and like they're like, yeah, no, we have, because I don't get it. Do you know what I mean? Like maybe that.
Yeah. Okay. Is another, I want to like briefly DSP reference it.
Yeah.
It's a bit like when, if I was on That Being Said with other guests, like the 1,000 subscriber special, where we were all just there to shit on Phil and it was great. And occasionally I might get asked, oh, so, what about his narcissism here or something like that? Talk for a brief bit, but it would be very brief and very quick and very like to convey it to other people so that other people understand like this concept. But when I'm talking with Baxter, who did the work on, Reclusive in Renton, and did like really good look at Phil and Nas, I could talk on that level. So it's like you go a level deeper. It's like talking to someone in the same industry as you.
Yeah.
Talk about stuff that you have in common that other people might not. I would imagine like if you were somebody who like manufactured screws or iron girders or something like that, and you met somebody else who also manufactured, you could talk like in a pub, but oh my god, this new like importing steel from China, or this new legislation that affects this, new machines that press this, and other people around him in the pub that would be mates to them would be like, talk about the football or something. They're going. It's that like sort of thing. So when you see like it's true crime.
With true crime, and the difference between true crime and screws is that like sometimes you need time to what we used to call decompress. Like if I was out filming something or doing something like that and it was hectic or serious, or like sometimes we'd film someone talking about their mental health and they'd be feeling upset. Afterwards we all need to decompress and maybe talk about it. And so until like mental health is a good example, talking about mental health is the most important thing you can do to help you deal with these feelings. So you do need to find ways to express those feelings, like, and with true crime they're really serious like feelings, aren't they, because it's dealing with this brutality. So yeah, so you can't really sort of like couch it in the same way like a dramatization could. You're just too aware that these things really happened. You might be watching like a dramatization of Jeffrey Dahmer killing somebody, but you also know like at some point somebody felt that knife going into their chest, as thrust by Jeffrey Dahmer. So you're aware of like the reality of it as well, and you're aware of that sort of aspect. And yeah, it's just one of those things that you can't shut off. It makes watching like TV shows and films and documentaries and stuff a real night. So this is where we get onto YouTube, because this is what you yourself as a forensic psychologist are gaining from I'll do no introduction needed, is there? Now on
subscription.
Now on YouTube we've got real crime. It's moved from dramatization to the actual footage of the interrogations from people that have been arrested. The general format from channels like Jim Can't Swim, Red Tree Crime, to name just a few. There's a whole genre now built up around this Jim Can't Swim-esque style video, which is that you are just introduced to a character. They are the antagonist, the murderer, and they've done the bad thing, and they're in the police custody, and the police are interviewing them, and through the process of about an hour, 2 hours, however long it takes, eventually their confession is brought out to the fore, or maybe not. Then very finally, very short at the end, you might see this is what happened to them in court, this is the result in their sentence. But in the main, it is the unadulterated footage of the real criminal in the process of interrogation, and that's grown really on YouTube. So I've got questions for you on this, a few, and then we're going to like sort of tidy up and finish up at the end, I suppose. My first question, what was interesting that's come organically here is that you were just saying about this, it was described in chat as like a burden, like this difficulty, this other layer, this level that it allows you access to that is actually psychologically difficult to deal with because it's the brutal reality. And people seek this out on YouTube. Like, people want to be in your shoes, that to see deeper. They want to be able to almost be in that situation to feel the knife. And so this more real, like, we're not looking at the actual CCTV of a crime, but we're the closest step away, hearing the actual murderer describe the murder. So why do you think people are gravitating towards this true crime content?
It sort of goes back to like what we mentioned before, that the ultimate question that you could ask a serial killer is, why did you do it? What made you do it? And it's that. You are seeing that. You are seeing a criminal being interrogated and them telling you why they did it. So there's a great sort of like reassurance there in seeing the system at work. You are seeing police investigating. You are seeing a criminal being interrogated. You are seeing like a conclusion being reached. And then at the end, you know, somebody comes in, reads them the rights, puts them in handcuffs, and then you cut to, they were in court, they were charged with this, they got this many years. So you see the process. It's reassuring in that regard, because it's like completely unbiased. You get somebody telling you, like Jim Can't Swim style presentation of, here's the crime, here's the suspect, and then you get the main body of the video is the interrogation, and occasional pauses to describe, like, here the interrogator is trying this read technique, here the investigator wants to put pressure on the suspect so that they might contradict themselves later, and here the suspect is likely to be feeling it. So you get like descriptions and explanations along the way of, here is your system at work. So there's a great reassurance to it from people who, you know, previously you would have to watch something like, say, Crime Watch, and again that wouldn't feature the sort of like the main investigation. It would be like asking for help and then telling you, hey, do you remember the crime we told you about last week? Well, we've had some breakthroughs.
And really interestingly, that we didn't cover earlier, that's a form of dramatization of the crime. But to catch the killer, they literally reenact the crime so that it jogs someone's memory, so that someone rings in and calls in. So they literally reenact the crime before the criminal is brought to justice. Yeah.
It was a very, I don't know if our American viewers are aware of it. Crime Watch was like the 80s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's public service broadcasting on the BBC, and I think it was 80s, and it featured crimes that were unsolved. So it was from a news desk style show, and the format would be a list of crimes that are unsolved, maybe a police most wanted, few pictures, and they would literally dramatize them, and then at the end they would then tell you the success stories of the people that had been arrested this week, and please don't have nightmares was the sign-off line, until Jill Dando, one of the main presenters, was murdered outside her own home, and then it sort of came to a petering out. It's not even still going now. Not after one of the presenters was murdered. So it all ties in. I'm not going to go into the Jill Dando murder because I don't know anything about it, but just the fact she was murdered was some kind of bitter irony from, a good few years of chasing down criminals on television. Yeah.
Yeah, but again, that sort of reassurance of, look, here's the system working. Here's the police trying to interview you. You would get like an outline of the crime and the reconstruction, and then it cut to like, okay, we now go to the police superintendent who's going to show you like a piece of evidence or something like that, and it's like, here's the picture, here's the e-fit, here's like this size shoe print was found at the
and it was the actual police were in it as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, they were actual policemen involved in it. There wasn't just like a reenactment of them or somebody playing a police. They were actually there. It was just genuine appeals to the public for information. So it did sort of serve that purpose, but it wasn't reenactment for the sake of either documentary or dramatization. It was, look, we need information, we need evidence, we need somebody out there must know this person. So that was the thing. And here again is the same thing on YouTube. You are seeing the system, you are seeing a process of, here's the police, here's where,
you're taking the face off the watch and you're seeing all the cogs going round in the system.
Yeah,
like you're getting an actual view of the mechanics of the actual workings of the justice system. Yeah.
And again, you need that reassurance because it's terrifying otherwise, isn't it? That's why these police programs have long since held a particular fascination in society and in a certain subsect of society, because it's reassuring to see, the police have all these weapons available to them. They have CCTV, they have DNA profiling, they have psychological profiling, they have like boots on the streets, they have fingerprinting and voice recognition, all this. They've got all these things to help in the pursuit of criminals and to protect society. So there's a reassurance there. And when you see it in the Jim Can't Swim style videos of, here's the police understanding the psychology of criminals to get them to confess, it reassures you that once the police have their man, if they've got their criminal, they will make them confess. So yeah, there's a great reassurance to people in that regard, as well as obviously getting to vicariously live through a detective or an investigator. You get a feel for how things are done. It's very interesting to see a tactic being, you might say, like, why are the police questioning him about this day here particularly, and then later on it's explained to catch him in a lie. If he says he's here then we've got a piece of evidence that contradicts that, so we know he's lying. And so, you know,
that's a very good
we will
point,
hold
isn't
that
it?
back until later.
Is that as humans, we want to know when we are being manipulated or deceived, and this is a case of somebody fighting for their life. If they reveal to the police that they have done the crime, they're going to go to prison, and it's going to go very badly for them. So they're literally, this is their last chance to fight for their life, even though they're the criminal. And like, you know, we're not in their we're not cheering for them. They're fighting for their life, and we're hoping that the police manage to catch them. And through the sort of, again, earlier, like we said earlier, like this dance between the two, somewhere between there is this really interesting moment that the liar is caught out. The police are able, like you said, to use tactics and decisions and ask the right questions that then they can go back over and re-corroborate the story and bring out inconsistencies. And these are the techniques that catch the liars, that it's like the actual moment of justice, isn't it? Like with Phil, we're always like referring to the evidences, and he says this, but look, there's the evidence that proves it otherwise. And that in crime, in forensics, it's about evidence. Here it's the actual confession from the mouth of the criminal that is drawn out through this process. And it's that chess game that is, to me, I suppose, it's like watching almost like a sport or like a hunt, maybe, and the joy of the success, seeing the criminal brought to justice.
That sort of competitive aspect to it is like a chase. It is a dance between two people. It is a competition. I'm lying, and you've got to, you know, I want to prove you did that to get you to confess to it. That sort of thing. It's almost competitive. And we do have a lot of human history. It's just a thing that we, but in this sort of context, there's a moral aspect to it, because again, the police are the good guys, the criminals are the bad guys. The police are operating on behalf of society, and the bad guys, the suspects, the people who have transgressed our laws, see them caught, you want to see them punished. So you have the moral aspect of, it's not just showing you here's the mechanics of it, here's the tools that they use. It's here's the tools that they use to protect you, to enforce social norms, to make sure criminals don't get away, all that sort of stuff. And again, that's a reassurance, just like Crime Watch was, just like 999 was, just like all those programs, just like police camera action, those sorts of things where, you know, you cameras will follow police. Cops on Fox, huge show, fucking huge show back.
Yeah.
For a reason. It showed you police doing what they do. It showed you the arbiters of societal norms and laws going and doing.
I agree with you here, because it's like where the line was drawn. Like in Cops, there's like a moment where you know it's going wrong for the person they're arresting because they're about to be slammed on the floor, and like, you know, the cops have this sort of line that gets crossed, and there's no nonsense after that. Here is the line, so you know that there is at least a line that doesn't get crossed, you know. Like you said, I didn't perceive that myself. When I was watching these things, I felt less, like, maybe as well, I'll move this on slightly, but I'll come back to you for what you're saying as well, because I felt less reassured when I was watching these murder interrogations than you're describing here, but I understand what you're describing. But I think when it's contextualized differently, like when I was talking to you earlier about makeup videos, where there's a really new phenomenon on YouTube where makeup YouTubers who start with no makeup and put on loads of makeup, during the process they're doing true crime, and they're just telling you the story of a true crime thing that happened. And so it's like a weird mashup video of true crime and makeup tutorial, and they're very popular at the moment. And I think that's because, again, it sanitizes or desensitizes or safe spaces. Like someone's now telling it me in a very conversational way, and they're doing makeup, and I can feel like happier about the look and the vibe than the raw reality. When I'm in the Jin Can't Swim videos, I'm in the raw reality of the police interrogation, and there is for me a feeling of still jeopardy and edge, and like what the killer enjoy. I don't know what murderers enjoy, but like after you've done it, you must feel really guilty and scared that you're going to get caught. And like for me, there's this like, you know, watching someone about to get caught is like this edge, like excitement thing. But for the makeup people and stuff like that, they tone it down. They make it easier to digest and to hear, I suppose.
Yeah. True crime mukbangs a thing. I'm pretty sure.
Is that right? That's exactly the same sort of thing, then, isn't it? It's
it's exactly that.
Taking the thing that's very difficult and recontextualizing it so it's more literally digestible in the mukbang way. But
it makes it safe. It removes it from the sort of the reality of like a Jim can't swim, explore with us. This is monsters sort of video to. You're a bit more comfortable. You're in a conversational context. You're in a setting where that sort of casual connection is supposed to be established. You have like a theme of, you know, we're just chilling. Mukbangs are there to be makeup streams are there so that you can chill. You're supposed to just feel a relaxed thing. So talking about things in a casual sort of conversational way, even if they're such dark subjects, puts it that way. I've seen it called murder porn. That's a very good description of it. Because I don't actually like that chapter.
I was going to say, like, murder porn, like I would say maybe we need to make two different categories here then. Now I love making categories and putting things in categories, but maybe we should make two different categories because some people are probably, like you say, more reassured by hearing these stories and their resolutions, even though they're quite brutal, scary things. We're talking about the dramatization or now the presentation of these stories on YouTube, and a lot of people make their own sort of like there's one that I watch called Shrouded Hand that produces like dark content.
Oh, I know the guy. Hello everybody.
Hello.
Shrouded Hand here.
Shrouded Hand shouts out on Halloween to Shrouded Hand. So like there's that sort of spooky side to it, but there's also a more normalized YouTuber presentation of just like I was saying, the makeup people, you know, a more sort of easy, comfortable space to deliver it in. So I think you've got like what you were saying, like a reassurance vibe in some content, and in other content you've actually deliberately got a more anxiety-inducing, spooky vibe going, maybe. So maybe some people want to be like, because people look at horror movies and say they want to be scared, but we're sort of saying, I'm learning from you today that whilst you want to be scared, you also want to feel safe at the end, and it's that safety that makes you go away feeling happy, not the anxiety you felt that you were scared. And I don't know about the South Park episode myself, so I can't tell you whether I like it or not, but let's let Steve talk now, because I've been talking.
You do. you get that sort of reassurance from it because you're sort of sharing the experience with other people, and you're sharing it through like watching it as in a horror movie. You are watching like the characters go through that process, and then you're like, oh, at that point I'd do this or that. So you're reassured by yourself. Same with this. You are reassured by the idea that the police are doing what they do, and at the end of the day they get their man. But you know, it again in terms of the context of the presentation, the idea that it being in a more casual setting just removes another layer of fear and worry, and it makes it safer. It softens the blow and lets you explore it in a much more, I don't want to say comfortable way, but you know, it just sort of makes it easier to digest if you're not ready to take on the full sort of like extent of, say, a Jim Can't Swim video or like a forensic lecture.
Why don't you like the South Park murder porn video? Sorry, it's coming up in chat.
Oh no, it's no. It's the chapter. There's a YouTuber called That Chapter, and personally, I don't like him because there are times when he'll be talking about something serious, and I think when he puts in jokes, it's inappropriate.
All right, I've done that today, but I haven't done many.
No. I don't necessarily. Right, okay. But, right, so I don't necessarily have a problem with it. There's an example. So let me just be clear.
He likes the South Park episode.
Yes.
He likes it.
South Park.
He fucking likes it. There's a YouTuber called That Chapter, and I'm not throwing shade at any YouTubers, but we're talking contextually about the work that they produce, and sometimes they make jokes that Steve doesn't resonate with. So
yeah, personally,
that's a slightly different thing that we're saying there, right? Yeah.
There is an example because there's also a podcast I listen to called All Killer No Filler, and it's two female comedians who talk about serial killers and other killers.
Right.
And they make jokes because they're comedians, but they do they make it very, very clear right from the start that they fully recognize these people are bad people, they did horrible things, and there's victims, there's actual real people involved in these crimes. So they take it on fully in the way. Whereas with that chapter, there's some times where he'll be like telling, like, you know, so that day he wakes up and the first thing he does, bashes his wife, bashes her about the head, and then goes out, kills his son, and then goes off on a rampage. Boy, he sure woke up on the wrong side of bed that morning, didn't he? You know, and those things just sort of feel inappropriate to me.
It's about context setting and tone.
Yeah. And so there's something about the tone that chapter strikes that doesn't really sit well with me, but that's a personal thing for me rather than just like a condemnation of it, because my brother listens to him as well. My brother quite likes
this. Is another point as well, that up to this point, media has been produced by bigger establishments, so responsibilities, decisions, they have to go through the Ofcom. They have to go through like a board, has to regulate their work, and you know, there's these bigger conversations that go on in production circles that lead to production decisions. Whereas with YouTube, I'm shouting a bit, aren't I? I'm actually getting excited. I'm shouting. I don't have to have a microphone. But with YouTube, people are free to make their own decisions and do whatever the fuck they want. It's the Wild West, and so this was going to come on to my next sort of question in this area, which is how YouTube handles delicate topics, because in recent years we've seen a change, haven't we, in YouTube? They've decided that certain things are not monetizable, certain things are, and that gives a point towards, if you don't have your own ethics, these are YouTube's ethics, and this is what YouTube thinks, I guess.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because a lot of the things that are affected by that decision, you know, you need nuance to understand. Like, you can't just blanket ban all discussion of, say, sexual abuse, because then you silence survivors trying to talk about it and people trying to raise awareness of it. You can't sort of like blanket but say like any discussion of suicide isn't monetizable, because you then, you know, you remove, and you're pushing down in the algorithm as well people who might talk about being a suicide survivor, or people who've like dealt with suicide thoughts, or people who have known people who've committed suicide and talk about
and whilst I'm happy to have you saying these things, I'm also aware as a content creator that this may in some way shadow ban this video off the YouTube algorithm, because you've mentioned the words. So if anyone's watching this, it's your responsibility to share it and comment in the chat for algorithm. But tips, sorry, tips. Yeah, I need to pay my back taxes. But
yeah, 2 huge bills coming up.
But yeah, no, I worry more about growing as a content creator through organic growth, and the fact that some of the content that we cover is literally shadow banned by YouTube in some ways if you tickle the algorithm with the wrong words. So, you know, this is YouTube's method of I use it in a positive sense usually. I try and tickle the algorithm, try and give it a little, you know, little tickle with some of the hashtags or whatever, but all the content. But in this way, it kind of, maybe it's pulling the algorithm's hair in a different way, isn't it? Maybe it's antagonizing it, because the algorithm doesn't like it. It pushes it down. It says you've mentioned these bad words, that's not going to be on there. But yeah, it's a huge market for YouTube, for the bigger channels. Like Jim Can't Swim actually left YouTube, where the problem. Jim Can't Swim actually was forced to leave YouTube because of the monetization. They've not really come back, but other people have filled their void. But YouTube's had a bit of a U-turn on whether you can monetize any conversation about it. But the problem is that the automated algorithm just shuts things down, and like you say, it's not ethically correct to not talk about these things, but also YouTube doesn't want to sort of be a Wild West where anyone just says anything about anything, do they? So
yeah, no, ultimately YouTube have their own standards, they have their own idea of what they want on their platform, and we have to abide by that. It's a difficult thing, because ideally that relationship would go both ways. You would have conversations between YouTube executives and people working there and creators, say, look, here are the problems that we've had, but that conversation doesn't happen. That, you know, that talk is not always a two-way street, and as a result, you end up with like algorithmic decisions that don't really consider nuance or context, tone. So it's a difficult one, but ultimately we are all agreeing to this because we're here on the site. So, you know, until such time as they change their minds, we have to abide by that decision. And it does mean, like, I couldn't talk about like the forensic statistics and psychology behind intimate partner violence, because that would just be crushed. So, you know, which is a shame, because, you know, that's something that you'd spend a lot of time learning about in psychology and interest.
Yeah, and certainly something that I'd be happy to talk about in a full episode. Just we'd have to be doing it in the knowledge that it would not be, you know, you can't expect it to get many views on YouTube. It's just the way.
And there'd also be many fewer jokes. So, But it does. We still do have like a creative space, and at least YouTube has allowed people, that wouldn't necessarily have the chance. People like Jim Can't Swim, Coffee House Crime, that chapter. People who wouldn't ordinarily be able to get like a series onto say Netflix, Channel 4. They have a voice here. They have like a channel here. They have a way to express themselves, to do their own thing here. So.
Certainly, it's relaxed enough recently so that people can talk about true crime. And I've noticed as well that there are a rise in sort of almost reporting. This is where I'll get to that last question that I had for you, and then we can ask you to tell me anything that you put on your notes that you wanted to tell us that we haven't covered, and then I'll give us a palate cleanser at the end. But YouTube seems to have relaxed slightly their rules so that you can talk about true crime. But there's been a rise of some channels that literally, I don't want to name any particular ones, but like, because I actually watch them for the sake of learning, and seeing the reality, like, I'm interested, but it's almost like car crash crime in that it's the worst crimes, it's the most horrible crimes, and it's all the worst things. They're not reporting, general news, and yet, so those channels can grow, but I know they can't be monetized because YouTube wouldn't monetize all these reports of shootings, stabbings, over and over again. So they must have, I'm guessing, some power in the fact that they've got so many viewers. Maybe they find some other way of monetizing it, or maybe they're just doing it for the sake of having a big channel. But it's interesting that so my final question was, why do you think people, us as humans, all of us, are interested in the worst things? That was what I said at the very start of the episode, what we'd ask is the most difficult
Nicely
question.
circling back to it now.
Why do people want to hear about the worst things?
Again, just going all the way back to Jack the Ripper, it is just a way to sort of like see it happening, sort of like be reassured. Here's evidence that the police are doing something about it. Here's a statement from somebody. Here's an explanation. Here's an opinion from somebody who lives in the area. It's a way that we can deal with these topics because they are dark and serious things, and they ultimately do remind us of our own mortality and the idea that we are going to die. And that's a really terrifying thought for most of us. We don't like admitting it. We don't like thinking about it. But it's still something we have to process. It's not something we can run away from. It's not something we can ignore. We have to process it in a certain way. And so stuff like this, stuff like true crime channels, is just like the ultimate end of the penny dreadfuls and the early prints of newspapers in Victorian times. It's the way that people talk. It's the way that people can reflect the ideas and the attitudes of the society at that time. You come on and you have a channel, talk about something, you're giving your opinion, you're giving your thoughts, and that's a reflection of you and your channel, and people who watch you will either agree or disagree, and they're all also as free to go and talk about it as well. So it's just a human need to process it because it's such a dark thing. We can't outrun it, we can't avoid it, so we have to deal with it. And when it's something as brutal and as visceral as this, as true crime, because everybody hopes one day be asleep, nice and old, 80s, 90s, I'll be asleep one day and go, I mean, be nice. Not everybody gets that luxury. So this is one of the ways that we process one of the myriad ways that we could die. And it's statistically, not many of us are going to end up victims of a serial killer, but it's one of those things that becomes glamorous because of the disproportionate weighting of it, because it's such a morbid fascination to us. It's had depictions throughout history, throughout fiction, throughout cinema and TV. There's been books written about serial killers, there's been documentaries made. It's always been like a morbid fascination. There's always been like your spree killers, your mass shooters, your murder, just general, even just singular murders. Sometimes a singular murder can capture the nation's crime session for months. That can dominate the nation. It just is a way of us all processing this public trauma. We privately will deal with death in our own way, but this is a public way of doing it because it's a communal thing that brings us closer as we're all going through this process. Think about like how society changes, like with James Bulger, with Sarah Payne, with
interestingly there as well, I wanted to say that
Hindley, all of it.
Because we haven't maybe covered so many of these specific cases I thought we would tonight, and we're getting on for 3 hours, but we will, if you want, I'll let you talk for another 40 minutes on any of those cases. That's fine. Or we could do a full episode on any of those particular cases, because that's what we're about. But interesting that when you listed those later cases, we do start to focus on the victims more, and especially if it's a child, child or someone particularly vulnerable, or a child really, it becomes the Jamie Bolger case rather than the John Venables and Robert Thompson case. So that focus is taken off the criminal and onto the victim. And earlier I asked, do we forget about the victims or lose sight of them? In but serial cases, we do tend to lose sight of the victims, and especially when they're adults from a more maybe seedy side of life that they've been selected from. But when it's a child, it becomes I wanted to say Madeleine McCann case, but they haven't confirmed that they murdered her yet.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, yeah. But
it's a fun podcast now that you've committed that libel. You're right. You're right. You're at a very right point there, because again, it's children at this point. It's not just the taboo of killing. It's an extra taboo of you've killed a child. A man-on-man violence is, if one man ends up dead in a fight, there's an expectation there that, this murderer will be punished. But it was a man-on-man thing. It was ostensibly a fair fight. One of them came out the victor, one of them came out the loser. There's like an understanding that they're on more or less the same level, But it's against children. Children are defenseless. Children are sweet and innocent and pure. Children should be protected and under the watchful parental gaze of a guardian. A societal figure, a parent, an aunt, a police officer, care worker. There's somebody, a teacher, somebody should be watching the children at all times. And these cases show that no, they're not. Not everybody can be trusted. Not everybody can be, you can't trust every teacher. You can't trust every parent. You can't trust every relative. So it strikes at us more so than serial killing does, because it is the most vulnerable in our society. Children literally cannot defend themselves, usually by an adult that they've had some knowledge or trust of.
And also they become immortalized and I think immortalized is the wrong word completely, but memorialized is probably the right word. And the brutality of their murder is often later. It's the memory of the child is the main thing that is memorialized rather than the maybe the particulars of the cases. I was going to talk a little bit at the end about vigilantes, and I had, like I said, I had sort of said maybe we'll move on to talk about the pedo hunters, which I think it comes from this desire from society to fight back against these horrors that they see in the media. We couldn't all save Madeleine McCann, but there's now groups of people who go out hunting, vigilante style people on the internet and putting them to justice and stuff. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, you can. Otherwise, I'm happy not to talk about that. And
I think it might be worth saving that later.
Because it doesn't.
Another episode, because
Yeah.
I have a feeling this is all the result of To Catch a Predator.
Right.
So I feel like it might be worth going into To Catch a Predator and the legacy of it, because it sort of like basically created that. I don't want to say genre, but it basically created that sort of, talk to somebody on the internet and see where it goes.
The formula.
That sort of thing, yeah. So they sort of like really pioneered that, and it became a huge thing. Again, that's like Cops. That's one of those shows where you could be like, that had a distinct effect on how society viewed something.
And it's not really appropriate because we don't really have gangs of vigilantes out trying to catch. Like, even though Jack the Ripper, like you said, had gangs of vigilantes out looking for him, these days, if there is a potential killer on the loose, whilst I think it's interesting that the media, like the YouTube generation, they put out endless content. I do as well about Madeleine McCann. Check out my videos. Madeleine McCann has this people trying to bring the case to justice to account. Unsolved cases will continue to be brought up on things like YouTube, and that vigilantism is sort of alive and well in what they call, what's the word for it? It's something journalism, like independent, not independent though. It's like
guerrilla.
Maybe, or like personal journal, or but like independent, individual journalism on YouTube is still alive and well, even if it's not like literally manhandling people into the back of a van. It's a form of vigilante justice, I guess.
Yeah, basically, yeah. But again, we also have this like sort of like the Robin Hood thing. We have this romanticized ideal of vigilante, and the reality is, again, once you've been through forensic, the reality is, we discourage vigilantes for a reason. It's like, it's not, it should be a thing that is seen as not necessarily taboo, but it's frowned upon by society because it's going outside of society's norms. We have the norm of the police investigate, and then the Crown courts decide to charge, and then your victim is your offender is prosecuted and sentenced and all that stuff. We have that system in place to deal with issues of justice and reparation and restitution when a crime has been committed. We don't sort of like empower random citizens to go out and be judge, jury, and executioner. We like write parodies of it. We write characters that allow us to sort of like explore those ideas in situations that are not too far removed from reality. Like I know most people are thinking of Batman. I'm actually thinking of Judge Dredd, because he is literally, like Vigilante's an outlawed Mega City one, but he is literally judge, jury, and executioner at that point. He follows the book of the law, but he's the one out there on the street deciding, right, you're the criminal, I'm going to decide.
I always thought Judge Dredd feels like they cut out all the middlemen, and he's just like one person doing all the jobs, like making all the decisions.
Fucking great. Yeah. It's a great series. I've got like a bunch of 2000 AD comics in a box in my bed. I fucking love Judge Dredd. But it's the idea that we have an institute to deal with justice, and vigilantism sort of goes against that. But you can also understand why people get emotional over something like, say, Madeleine McCann or James Bulger. You can understand why people would want some sort of vengeance or reparation or restitution from that, because it's a very emotive subject. The point is, though, the law isn't supposed to be emotional. The law is supposed to be cold. It's supposed to be clinical. And it's supposed to be fair. And you can't be fair if your biases are clouded by emotion. Because you're not thinking like as rationally as justice demands.
You can't meter out discipline.
Thing to get across.
You can't meter out discipline if you yourself have lost your discipline. Like if you've lost your temper, that's it. And also, like, vigilantes haven't been versed in all the different aspects, have they? So they're just taking it upon themselves to perform a role that they assume they understand the role, but without any deeper study. And there's other factors that go into performing that role of like police, isn't there, than just go out and grab the criminal and put them in the back of the van. So
because you have to then prove that this person did it, and what's your evidence?
Well,
what about if you get the wrong person? What about if you get an innocent person?
These are going to go on to deeper questions about crime and justice, which we can talk about in the future. What I wanted to ask you at this juncture is, have you got anything, because you showed me just briefly before we started that you had a load of notes, and I wonder, is there anything on your notes that I haven't directly asked you that you came prepared for, that you think, oh, you didn't ask me about that, or did I not give you opportunity to...
You actually through like some skillful moving through topics, we did actually cover most of it. There's just one bit that we missed about eBay and murderabilia. That I thought was really interesting. Let's talk. Sort of moved on from serial killers. But
let's talk about that then, because you prepared it and it was interesting, and I forgot to ask you about it. And then I'll just as a palate cleanser, and for you in chat to get ready for this, as a palate cleanser at the end, I'll just ask you what your favourite horror films are and why you like them, and then we'll have a little chat about horror films, because it's Halloween and that can make us all feel a little bit happier that we've just been to the movies and it's all okay at the end, and that's just popcorn down my leg, not somebody's teeth. It's a very weird thing, because this is eBay and
murder
memorabilia.
Yeah, basically, because you have sort of basically two forms of murderabilia, and one is like items actually associated with the offender. So maybe like letters from prison or drawings.
All right, okay. So first, I was immediately going to say, aren't these things evidence?
Yeah, no, not like that. Stuff like something like what are the? I think it's
a Bronson painting. Did Bronson
like
murder?
Yeah. He looked murdered. So
as you do, went down the shops.
It's a strange. I don't really know why people become like fascinated with serial killers to the point where there'll be groupies for them, but it is a thing that happens.
Was it the Cat Bally who said earlier about groupies for somebody as well in chat?
Nuttifer mentioned it.
Nuttifer might have mentioned it, yeah.
So I don't really know why. It's always going to be a number of reasons, and it will be dependent on the individual. But the idea, John Wayne Gacy, thank you. That was who painted.
Right.
And that's how you end up with the Son of Sam law, because the Son of Sam was in prison and he wanted to write a book and have it the profits from it. But the Son of Sam law is different. But either way, there's like a law in America that stops. I think it is the Son of Sam. I'm getting confused. there's a law in America that stops offenders profiting from their crimes. So
it reminds me of recently there was a man who went on Rampage and he was known as the real Grand Theft Auto, and he got viral because he jumped from car to car and the police were filming it, and he wanted the rights. He wanted the rights from the film clips so that he could become the reason he said at the end of it that like he wanted to become, now that he's famous, he wants to profit off it, and they won't let him because of these laws, which is unfair. But
that sort of like law exists for a reason, because there's an audience for that sort of thing. So you have that aspect of murder memorabilia, which is like, I suppose you can see like a fascination to it. You can see like I want to understand why, I want to talk to this person. There's something about this person that is magnetic or entrancing, even though they've done a horrible thing, and I want to know why. I want to get to talk to them. You can sort of see that. But the other aspect is items that are like inspired by these people and their crime. So you'll have like I think it's a John Wayne Gacy, Ed Gein. It's an Ed Gein butcher apron, you know, so you could like, you know, barbecue.
I get the joke, but I mean, fucking hell.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Oh, you'll have like Dharma's Diner clock that has like the hands of the clock are actual like arms and hands, and it's like there's and dolls and things, and people making sculptures and statuettes and things. And there was an example, because I was reading a book called Criminal Visions, which goes into like media in advance for this. It was I was reading a chapter on it, and they talked about a Dharma doll which you could open up, and inside there were like there was like things from another victim, so you could pull them out and see inside Dharma's stomach would be like a head and arms and bits that he'd eaten, and it's like, so there's people like making that sort of thing.
It's like there's dark fascination, and it turns into okay. So what I'm brewing in my mind here is like this idea that we've talked about it today, about how initially these characters were things in the media that scared people, and they were used to push media and promote papers because people were scared in general of this like phantom menace. And now that it's moved on to they're interesting characters in the media that in some way have become like I want to say anti-heroes. I want to actually use the word anti-heroes. And so with that, in the modern world, we talked as well about supervillains and these monsters and things like that. It seems to tie in that there would be some kind of merchandise that you can buy a Batman doll and a Joker doll, and a Joker is a murderer, and you know Bane I don't know if he did kill the people in the movie, I can't remember, but like, you know, the villains are murderers and they're bad people, but you still have a doll of them, you still have like, you know, the merchandise. And so like there's like, it seems to me that an audience who is fascinated with these characters, and again I'm talking about like you mentioned somebody else who was like definitely seen negatively. I wanted like draw a distinction between two, but those who are put up in this sort of, I don't know what the world is, like Marilyn Manson himself represents this sort of counterculture that
Child.
No, I meant Marilyn. Right, like that we're fascinated with them, and it's going back to Alice Cooper as well, like this horror goth evil, but like, you know, creepy. Like Marilyn Manson got famous because he was doing weird, creepy, like horrible, weird things.
I see what, yeah.
Like so, like there is like there's a market, not in the, like, I don't want to say occult or gothic because these are other like genres, but you know there is like a serial killer fascination horror movie scream mask vibe that you can put together, and there would need to be merchandise. And so if you're buying the books, watching the movies, buying into the characters, then it doesn't seem like a huge leap that someone would then create a range of dolls that you can play with and mess about with to your heart's content. Yeah, it's very interesting. That I think it might be a symptom of capitalism in a way, that there needs to be merchandise.
Okay, so just to like fill in the gaps here, this is from Spectre Studios, a small independent business in Denver, Colorado, who makes the figurines. And it says here in the book, most disturbingly, the site promotes a 2-foot-tall Dharma doll with a zipped front, inside of which can be revealed a recently consumed victim that can be pulled apart. As the advertising declares, open me up for a sure delight and see who I ate for dinner last night.
It's kind of funny. I'm laughing at it because we're contextualizing it in this way, but it's fucking funny and sick. Dark humor. It's okay to have dark humor, like we said as well. It allows us to process things, to get through the difficulties and look on a bright side that allows us to live and go to bed at night. And dark humor. I'd actually think that's kind of funny. Like after everything in all the years, I've never got a shelf behind me like streamers have. I'm using green screen most of the time, but I've always thought, what would I put on a shelf? Like I've got my old N64, but so is everyone. Now I'm thinking I need to get a Dharma doll to represent this episode we've done and put it on the shelf.
I've got a couple of things that I normally put on my desk when I'm filming like other things, but I could see a Funko Pop of Elvira. Funko Pop of Elvira, and I thought, you imagine a Funko Pop of like Ed Gein?
Yeah, see now we're getting into you're selling me on the concept of memorabilia.
Oh, but it's already done. That's the thing. eBay's like had to, just like YouTube and having to deal with inappropriate material on the site.
Right.
eBay has also had to deal with this sort of thing because
I suppose when do you start making Adolf Hitler dolls and advertising them on Amazon? Jeff Bezos probably doesn't want Adolf Hitler dolls on Amazon, does he? So
no, probably not. No. But again, that's the sort of thing. It's like it's a real person, real crime, real things happen. I suppose morally it's up to the individuals to decide whether they're okay with it or not.
I think those sounded more distant because they're American.
Yeah, there's that as well. Yeah.
I think if you told me that you were going to make
doll.
Yeah, like the more close to home it feels, the more distasteful it feels, I think.
Okay, so another Brass Eye example. Have you seen Brass Eye?
Yeah, I love Brass Eye. I just don't remember it as much because, like, back in my childhood, I was more stoned when I was watching programs like that than I had good reason to be. So,
might have to link this one in the description box. Do you remember the Pulp spoof that was Blouse? And they were in controversy because they'd written a song about Myra Hindley.
Vaguely, maybe. Not really off the top of my head, though, but yeah.
It's that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's exactly that sort of thing.
Although these days, you're telling me that, I can imagine someone like Nick Cave. I mean, I can see what they're parodying. Because I could imagine someone actually doing it. And Myra Hindley was made into that artwork with all the hands.
Yeah.
And that... people hated it, but I actually it's one of the thing I loved about that piece of artwork, because I actually love art, like in general. You love art. I love art in general. Like, well, they did all the hands, and it was children's hands, and it was Myra Hindley, and it's also very distasteful. But the thing that I loved so much about it was that it made the media, like, it was on the news, it was in the media, it was seen, and it was like someone's done some artwork that everyone wants to talk about, and that's like good art's doing that, and then we're having other conversations based on it. But really interesting stuff.
The point of art as a whole, don't you? Yeah. Conversation of should art shock and what is art.
Yeah, so it was like the most successful piece I've seen in many a year. Like, I thought it did a really good job. Like, even if some people saw it as distasteful, like, yeah.
But yeah, I just thought I'd bring that one up as well to say, like, just as YouTube with content, other sites have also had to deal with this sort of thing, because it appears to be a thing that we're going to do. It reduces it to a level that we can deal with it, rather than having to deal with the associated realness of it and the fact that real people were involved, real people were killed, and there's now real families without real family members in them because of this person. It reduces it to a level where it's a doll, it's an action figure, it's just a piece of plastic on our shelves now. It's a thing that represents an abstract sequence of events that happened in another world and another time. So it distances it from us, it couches it, and it makes it softer and easier to deal with.
Yeah, so I think that's got to be the takeaway from today, before I move us on to a more palate cleansing, just talk about cinema and like your favourite horror films just off the top, just to finish. But the takeaway is that we shouldn't lose sight of the reality of these crimes when we're consuming this media, because we're consuming it through the mechanisms that we also consume all the other fantasy world of whatever, Game of Thrones to Arthur Daly's Minder. It's all coming through that TV. You get used to it, you get comfortable with it, you get, through your phone you watch it.
There, man.
Sorry, repeat that one.
Deep British TV cuts there for your
deep British, yeah. Good point. Yeah, I like to do these things though. I'm laying the seeds for a bit in. That's a diversion in another stream where someone says, "What did you mean after Daly's Minder?" I go, "Oh, for 20 minutes now we can watch this and I can react to this on YouTube." So like, just laying the seeds. So Arthur Daly's Minder. But anyway, we consume the media through these. It has to come through a screen or through a headphones or whatever. It's your comfortable place, and we are now consuming all this media about this true crime, and we have the ability to feel comfortable with it, but we shouldn't lose sight of what is real and what is, like, not in a bad way, but in a, just like you said, we shouldn't lose sight of the victims, the people who have been hurt, and what really is, not that these people are, that these criminals are not like something to be made into posters and
not
turned
anti-hero.
into and
not ideal.
they're not fantasy figures that we are playing around with like Batman and the Joker. They're actual real people who did these horrible things. I think that's a good takeaway, isn't it? So have we covered everything on your notes there?
Yeah. Just give like 2 book recommendations for British viewers. There's a book that I've not got to hand right now. It's on the shelf outside, so I can't be asked getting it. But it's called Hooligan: History of Respectable Fears, and it goes into like this, but it goes back in time. It goes back to like the Victorian era and stuff like the BBC one about the gang starring Cillian Murphy. The Peaky Blinders, that's it.
Right, yeah.
Goes like to that era before and sort of like looks at culture around that time. For American ones, this is a bit more American-centric, which is called Popular Crime by Bill James. It's much more American-centric, so it's pretty good, but it's fairly chunky. Yeah.
So that's proof he knows stuff, look. He's got books. He's read them. That's it. I do sometimes the occasionally get a book out to show people that I've actually read a book on stream as well. My favourite...
I like to have like horses to hand.
My favourite stuff's by Noam Chomsky. I've always got a little slim volume of media stuff from Chomsky. I thought you were going to get a book there. No. Should we finish? What I want to finish off is like we've talked about all this sort of stuff, and it's kind of dark, and in chat, you've been forced to listen to us talk about all this dark stuff. Favorite horror movie, Notifier's mind. Let's ask a very. Let's have a very nice, just 3-minute, 4-minute, gentle reaction conversation about your favourite horror movies, and then I'll send us out, and Steve's going to stay on the line. I always say that to you so you don't accidentally just hang up when I finish the stream.
I know.
You know that. You know not to do that. So, so I'll ask you now, in a nice, that's all, no one's going to murder me and I'm not going to murder anyone. What's your favourite horror movie?
There's a couple, but for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to go with Alien.
Alien? That's a horror movie.
Alien, yeah.
It's a horror movie.
Yeah.
Alien.
It's like the best horror movies. Yeah, it's terrifying.
They're sci-fi.
Actually, the 3, I actually really like Alien 3.
Yeah, I love the films.
But Alien is a perfectly done horror movie.
Yeah, it is, I suppose. Yeah, there's a stalking presence and like... But I see it as sci-fi.
I know, it's in a sci-fi setting, but it's still a horror movie. It's like how Red Dwarf is comedy in a sci-fi setting.
What's the one where he has his eyes out, where he's...
Event Horizon.
Oh, I don't know that. That's the one. Event Horizon. That's a horror movie and a sci-fi. That's fucking like they had to cut it, didn't they, for Western audiences because it just got too brutal. And then when you've watched the film, you think, well, that was brutal. But I'm gonna have to go on the internet and find this little few seconds of scene that are gonna make my life worse. And then you go and look at it and think, I shouldn't have looked at that. Right, Event Horizon.
I love it. I love like there's just so many aspects of it. It's like it's an anti-capitalist one. It's a very feminist one.
Alien again now, yeah.
There's like so many themes of like rape and penetration and forced penetration.
Now you've said that word as well now, so this is never going to get monetized, you fucker. But like, yeah,
definitely. But yeah, Aliens, brilliant horror movie.
We do love it in our household as well. We named our cat Jones one time, and my sister. This is a weird memory, but when we were kids, we went to London, and I was into Citadel miniatures, painting up the little lead miniatures. And so my dad was like, "We're in London. What kind of shop do you want to go to?" And I was, "No, I want to go to the shop." And like, so we went in the shop, and like, we could each have a toy. So I bought myself some little Citadel miniature lead painty things, and my sister, who didn't care about any of that, spotted on the shelf Alien diorama little lead paintable miniatures, and so she got herself a little set of Alien, Sigourney Weaver, Ripley, the Xenomorph. She had the coolest stuff than me. But yeah, that's an interesting memory I've got. My favourite horror movie's got to be The Shining. I think that there's something about the occult and feelings of the occult that sometimes, I don't know if anyone will understand what I'm saying here, but it makes my eyes water when it makes me scared, but not water like I'm going to cry, but it makes me feel like I'm close to ghosts when my eyes are watering. It's like I've got like this, that's the psychic moment, and I'm scared of it, and my eyes are about like not going to cry, but it's like a funny feeling. And The Shining gives me that feeling in droves when it's like little Danny running around and being scared. Like, yeah.
Well, hell, there's a horror classic for a reason, isn't it?
Yeah.
So.
Did you know that because obviously Spielberg, am I talking about the wrong people, aren't I? Spielberg, what's his face? Kubrick made it, but it was written by, what's his name?
King.
Stephen King, and in the opening sequence, apparently there's an overturned vehicle which is supposed to represent Stephen King's vision for the book, and that Stanley Kubrick went off the tracks a bit and made his own movie. And I'm glad he did, because it's, you know, my favourite movie. Yeah, I'm wearing I'm wearing a Beetlejuice and horror movies. It's all Tim Burton. Yeah, decked out in the Tim Burton. Where's your cat gone?
She's up. So, yeah.
Right then, I think we're done here, yeah?
Yeah, I think we're good.
I think we're done.
A lot.
Thanks very much, everyone, for tuning into Thus. You know, I don't really have a designated sign-off line, but generally after a stream, I say, if you can't be good, you're naughty. But it feels really inappropriate tonight to say, if you can't be good, you're naughty. Because if you can't be good, you might be running around murdering people, in which case that's very naughty, and you should stop it immediately. You're gonna get yourself in a right load of bother. So you be good.